I'd like to welcome everyone to the town of Marshfield Furnace Brook Middle School. Momentarily, the FEMA officials will make a presentation and will respond to our questions about the new National Flood Insurance Program. But first, I would like to make some introductions and offer a welcome to the town of Marshfield. My name is Steve Robbins. I'm the chairman of the Marshfield Board of Selectmen. First, I'd like to welcome our neighbors to the north from the town of Scituate. Sean Harris, the chair, Anthony Vignani, John Dennehy, Martin O'Toole, and the Scituate Town Administrator, Patricia Fincasey. Marshfield Board of Selectmen members, John Hall, Matt McDonough, and our Marshfield Town Administrator, Rocco Longo. Hopefully you got to meet the other Scituate and Marshfield staff who helped provide assistance with the flood maps this afternoon from 4 till 7, which was a non-stop flow of residents from approximately 3:30 to 7 o'clock and continues to go on as we speak. Representing both towns in the state legislature are State Representative James Cantwell. From the Department of Conservation and Recreation, we have Colleen Bailey and Richard Zingarelli. Before I turn the microphone over to our FEMA guests, I would like to say on behalf of both boards, we're very grateful for the time and effort that went into setting up this meeting. I cannot possibly thank everyone involved, but we are proud to be hosting this meeting with our neighbors from Scituate. The Board of Selectmen has been diligent and supportive of the effort to reach every household in the town of Marshfield. Every household got a call as a courtesy of the Sheriff's Department. We now know the phone call was successful. It has been reported to me that we had about 120 residents visit Town Hall yesterday to find out about the new flood maps. Additionally, on Wednesday, September 25th, the Marshfield Board of Selectmen will repeat this session with town staff only in the Marshfield Town Hall from 5 to 8 to help Marshfield residents who could not be here this evening. We also recognize the magnitude and complexity of this issue. We will do everything possible to help get everyone a better understanding of this new program. The FEMA team will begin the presentation in a moment. When the presentation is complete, anyone with questions, please come up to these two front microphones and wait till you're recognized to present your question. Jim Quigley, a staff member of Congressman Keating's office, would like to now make a short statement.
I just have a brief statement from Congressman Keating. I wish I could join you tonight for this important meeting, but as ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, we requested that Secretary Kerry, Secretary Hagel, and Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff Dempsey testify before the committee prior to voting on our military involvement in Syria, and today was when they were able to fulfill that request. I am personally aware of the unique challenges facing homeowners in coastal districts and realize that the availability, I am personally aware of the unique challenges facing homeowners in coastal districts and realize the availability and cost of flood insurance directly affects some people's ability to afford a home. I have been involved and will continue to be involved in making the flood insurance program more effective and affordable. That includes voting for legislation to delay implementation of grandfather rates for certain policyholders affected by the flood insurance legislation, as well as to delay implementation of actuarial rates to allow FEMA the opportunity to study affordability issues and to ensure that new rates are affordable while also reflecting flood risk. If you'd like additional details on these pieces of legislation, please let one of my staff know. I remain committed to working to ensure the insurance program is sustainable, but most of all affordable for those citizens who most need it, like the residents of our coastal district. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We also have Congressman Lynch in the audience. If you could please come up and say a few words.
So Keating's not here?
He's in D.C.
Yeah. Okay. At a hearing for Sarah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the campaign.
Good evening, everyone. I'm here for a lot of the same reasons that you're here, I expect, and that is to learn more about the FEMA process and try to anticipate the problems and also figure out ways within the legislation and perhaps through amendment to the legislation to alleviate some of the problems that we see arising. First of all, when the so-called Biggert Waters legislation was passed, a lot of the impact was unknown. We were given estimates by some of the proponents that only 1 million homes nationally would be impacted by the changes in the law in terms of increases of premiums. We were also relying on very vague estimates about how many new homes would be classified within high flood risk areas, so that there was a fair amount of, I guess, scientific guesswork in terms of what the overall impact would be for any one given area. We have tried to get legislation to, first of all, let me say, there are 16 individual studies that are included within the Biggert Waters legislation because of all that uncertainty in terms of the impact on coastal communities. Some of those have started. I know one started on September 1st. It's a 19-month study that will initiate the mapping, the remapping sequence, and will give us a lot of data in terms of what the impacts might be in individual communities. There are other studies that are also in progress or about to start. So one of the amendments that, one of the correcting legislations that's going forward right now is sponsored by Cedric Richmond and Maxine Waters, which I am also on as a co-sponsor, would be to push back some of the most controversial and most troublesome aspects of the law itself until we have the answers from those studies. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do. The other thing, we recently had a debate in Congress over the Interior Department Appropriations bill. The legislation most important to this audience includes provisions for seawall construction. Now, as you know, there's a lot of debate going on right now in Congress regarding sequestration, which has the effect of pushing down the amount of dollars available for public infrastructure, as well as Defense Department cuts. About $600 billion in domestic expenditures, as well as $600 billion on the military. Well, there's a lot of pressure on funding for seawall construction, which in the Northeast is desperately needed because of the lack of maintenance over the years. I was successful. I had I was the only Democratic member of Congress to have an amendment accepted in the Interior Department Appropriations bill that was specifically to add $25 million for seawall construction, and that goes into the Army Corps of Engineers budget for that. That's just one provision, but it is one factor that will that FEMA will determine on how high the premiums will increase based on the remapping process for homes in high-risk floodplain areas. One of the mitigating factors will be the presence and the condition of seawalls. So we're trying to get it from that aspect as well.
It's not true.
So what I would like to do, is I'm here tonight to hear from you and from FEMA to be able to guide the process as we go forward. And I've got the calls in my office. I don't know how many of you are here from Scituate, but I represent Scituate. So I've got I've been on the call list for the families that have coastal property in Scituate. And I'm sure Bill Keating's been hearing from the folks in Marshfield, and I'm sure there are other residents of coastal communities here. We've got to try to work this the best we can, try to get as much information as we possibly can, and then go to work to make sure that look, and I'm not going to try to make any unrealistic promises here. What my goal here is to make sure that these changes don't undermine the owners of properties in coastal areas. And you may fall in different categories. Some of you may have never had a flood in your home, ever, or at least in recent memory. I've got calls like that, where people have told me, Congressman, I've never had a flood in my home. And now, you know, according to what I'm hearing, I'm in a high flood zone area, a high-risk area. My insurance used to be $650 a year, and now they tell me it could go as high as $7,000 or $8,000. I know some other people who have inherited their homes from their parents, and they've had these homes in their families for decades, for generations, and they don't want to be forced out. I've got calls from retired couples on fixed income who cannot absorb the increases in premiums that they're looking at. One of the factors that FEMA has to consider in their plan is affordability. That's one of the studies, one of the 16 studies that was part of the bill, because we were concerned about that. That study hasn't even begun yet. Well, actually, it might have started on September 1st, but we got a long way to go. So those are some of the factors and some of the issues that we want to hear from FEMA. In some cases, they don't have the answers yet. They don't. And it would be unreasonable to expect them to have it so soon. But the goal here is to mitigate the impact of this legislation. Some of the legislation comes specifically out of Katrina and also Sandy. There were some instances where on the Gulf Coast, some of the provisions that are now impacting our communities here along the Northeast are being impacted by provisions that were put in because of Katrina. Specifically, there were efforts, in some cases, there were homes, properties that were impacted by Katrina and other storms in the Gulf Coast area that received 4 different not 4 different subsidies, but 4 different insured events where those homes were basically completely paid for 4 times over. And there was an effort led by a lot of the Gulf Coast states to remap some of those areas so that people wouldn't just move back in because they were not stable. We see some of the effects of that being felt in the remapping area, the remapping sequence that's being implemented here. Those are unintended consequences. So to the best of our ability, and I speak for all of the mass delegation that represents coastal communities, we are going to try to correct that problem and make sure that the individual characteristics of our coastal community and our history here is recognized in the amendments to this process and in any way that we can lessen the effects on the homeowners here today and also those in Salem and anywhere else on the Massachusetts coast. So, thank you. But this is you know, in my previous district, I didn't have a lot of the coastal area. I went as far south as Dorchester. So, you know, now I've got a big group of coastal communities that need protection, and I fully intend to live up to my responsibilities. Thank you.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Ivy Francis, and she is with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name's Ivy Francis. I'm with FEMA, and I am... How's this? Okay. I'm Ivy Francis. I'm with FEMA at Region 1 out of the Boston office. I'm the chief of the Floodplain Management and Insurance branch. We have been doing these types of meetings now for the past month, all up and down the coast, and we understand the issues. We don't have a lot of answers to some of the issues that the congressman just brought up. What we do have answers to is where your property is on the proposed maps, and we can help you find your homes there on the maps. We will be here after the presentation, so if you haven't found that out already, please make sure that you go by into the cafeteria and do so. We also have insurance specialists here who can help you with specific insurance questions once you understand where you are on the new maps. Presently, what we'd like to do now is actually have a presentation from the experts here in Region 1 on the new maps and the science and engineering behind those maps. And then after that, we will talk about the flood insurance, have a presentation on the flood insurance. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Brian Caulfield with STAR, and he's the lead engineer on the floodplain maps. Thank you.
Thanks, Abby. As she stated, my name is Brian Caulfield. I work for STAR. We're a mapping partner for FEMA. We are a joint venture, and I represent one of the firms in that venture. And my job is I'm a project manager, and I'm also a coastal engineer. And so I'm the project manager specifically for the Plymouth County study. And the goal today is to kind of walk you through some of the engineering analyses before we get over to the insurance questions. And so what we've called this study is the physical map revision. A lot of people have asked why the maps changed so quickly since 2012. Your 2012 maps actually just represent the data that was currently in effect, just put onto an ortho photo and made into a county-wide submission. So there's no new engineering analysis for the Atlantic-facing flooding issues for Plymouth County. So that's what that map represents. So we were forced then as part, or not forced, but as in 2009, when Congress authorized FEMA for the risk map program, which stands for mapping, assessment, and planning, FEMA was then told to come back and to provide engineering updates to 100% of the coastal populated shorelines. And that's why we're back here now doing this analysis. What I want to talk about is this coastal flood hazard analysis recap, give you guys an idea of the public review and appeal period, talk just a little bit about letters and map changes, and then of course I'll turn it over for insurance. I'm not an insurance specialist, I'm an engineer. I want to start out with the timeline. I think this is very important for everyone to understand where we stand. We issued preliminary maps May 1st of 2013 to Plymouth County. We then held what we call a consultation coordination officer meeting. The whole idea is to basically get out to the communities and start to inform them about what they need to do to make the maps effective. And so that meeting was held June 6th in Plymouth County. And then what we start to do is we have to initiate an appeal process. And so to do that, we first publish in the Federal Register. And once we've published in the Federal Register, we then issue 2 newspaper publications. Because of the printing of the dates, they're 2 weeks, or it's a week apart. And that's why you'll see the dates of the 10th and 11th, and then the 17th and 18th. And so those dates then set when the study starts, and the appeal period is scheduled to close on October 16th. It's a statutory 90 days. It's in the Code of Federal Regulations. Once that appeal period closes, we then work through a final quality review, and we issue what's known as a letter of final determination. The date of that letter states when the maps are to go effective. So 6 months from when that letter is issued, that's when the maps will be effective. Because of town meeting requirements within Massachusetts, what we try to do is we aim for December to issue that letter of final determination that allows for the dates of the maps to be on the town warrant, because you do have to vote for the maps at town meeting. And so right now we're projecting all the mapping information, which is still subject to appeal and revision, would become effective June of 2014. So basically somewhere in the order of 10 months from now. So I want to talk about the coastal flood hazard analysis recap, and I want to kind of go over the history of coastal floodplain mapping. I'm going to pull both these up now, as I know some of the study was updated in 2006, but this is a timeline of how we look and evaluate the coastal flood risks. And what the timeline is beneficial in showing is that it's been an ever-evolving process. At the riverine level, we're still using the same hydraulic analysis, but at the coastal level, we're constantly updating and accepting new methodologies in how we implement and address the coastal flood risk. And so a lot of those changes to those processes are what we have now updated as we've gone into the new maps, which were those preliminary issuances of May 1st, 2013. What do we do for the study level updates? We perform just a coastal analysis. As I mentioned, it's a physical map revision, so we're not updating all of the maps within your community. It's only those subject to coastal flood hazards. And what we're focusing on, of course, is, as I mentioned, it was the area of Plymouth County only impacted from the Atlantic Ocean flooding. What data do we use? Our elevation data comes from what's known as the Northeast LiDAR mission. It was collected between 2010 and 2011. That data is collected such that it's sufficient to develop 2-foot contours, or basically it's a it's a contour elevation every 2 feet. But we actually use the digital elevation model, so it's the bare earth points as we develop our mapping. It gives us basically, if the elevation is shown to be 9.5, we can actually just go to 9.5 than rather to have to infer between the 8 and 10-foot contours. And all the engineering analysis we do is in accordance with FEMA's guidelines and standards. We call it Appendix D. It was issued in 2003, further updated for the Atlantic and Gulf coasts with an update in 2007. So those two documents combined, which are available from the FEMA website, so is the engineering analysis that we adhere to make the maps. This is just a kind of brief overview of the LiDAR coverage. What you can see is it truly is it's a full county-wide collection. So even those who may have questions about inland flooding concerns, there is a potential for topographic data back in that area. We just weren't funded to do that. It was solely looking at coastal physical map revisions. When we do a coastal analysis, we look at 4 components. We look at still water level, or what we tend to think of or call storm surge. We also consider wave setup. We look at overland wave propagation. We look at wave run-up and overtopping. And then finally, we consider primary frontal dunes. So we're required to do all 4 of those analyses at what we refer to as transects, or it's station elevation pairings along the shoreline. Those are shown on the flood insurance rate maps. So you'll see a line with it's a meatball, that's what we call it, with a number on the end. And that will tell you what transect you should look into. For this detailed still water level, we did not update any of the still water elevations. We found when we were doing our review that there's no tide gauges within Plymouth County. The closest tide gauge is Woods Hole and Boston. And we really can't interpolate between those two. The Woods Hole gauge is actually observing 2 different kinds of tides. And the Boston gauge, we just can't interpolate all the way down along the coast through Plymouth. So the decision was made, the best available data to implement for the flood study was to go ahead and take the effective data out of the flood insurance studies. So the numbers you'll see in the current update are the same as those from the 2012 flood insurance study. If you look at the report, it's basically the same table, just cut and paste. What we do for wave setup, as I mentioned, that's a term that we add into that still water elevation. It's numerically determined at each one of our coastal transects. When we do that, we basically are looking at the impacts of the wave energy versus the nearshore bottom friction. So what we're trying to evaluate, what we're trying to do is we're trying to explain how, as the waves break in the nearshore zone, they basically super elevate the water. And as they do that, it then causes a new water surface elevation into which we're mapping. And so a lot of the expansions of the floodplains throughout Scituate, Marshfield, and all of Plymouth County, at least when you're going out to the limit of the floodplain, if we've used the old still water elevation values, then the new floodplain is being driven by the wave setup terms. So that's really the limits of the floodplains. When we do overland wave propagation, what we're doing is we're looking at how does the landform interact with the wave energy as it propagates over the land. We look at, we consider obstructions. It's the way I view the world, unfortunately, now. Obstructions may be buildings, vegetations, marsh plains, but at the same time, some of those obstructions do not inhibit wave energy enough. Historically, what we've seen is that marsh grasses will tend to just bend and lay down during a storm event, and so they won't act as a significant reduction to wave energy. And so the waves can regenerate over marsh plains. So that's why you'll tend to see wave energy existing in the marsh plains themselves. And what we're doing is we're evaluating this all the way out to the limit of the 1% chance flood. So again, that's at still water elevation plus the wave setup term. When we look at wave run-up and overtopping, this is my favorite picture. It should be near and dear to many of your hearts. This is Scituate. And so really the map we're representing for wave run-up is much less an elevation-based risk, but it's a coastal influence risk. What happens here, of course, as you all know, the waves, as they hit the shoreline, they entrain the nearshore sediments, tends to be pebbles. And then when you have onshore winds, you end up with shotgun blasts against the homes. And so you get destruction of second-story windows, you get damage to your vinyl siding or any shingle siding. And so that's the risk that's being communicated. It's not that you're going to be flooding, like a static water surface elevation, but it's much more of you may have built too close to the shoreline and you should push yourselves back a little ways to make sure that you're not going to get hit by this type of information. And so that's really the risk that we try to portray when we make these maps. I know it's tough. The last one, the last term we look at is primary frontal dunes. We do identify primary frontal dunes. We actually utilize, primary frontal dunes were defined in Scituate as part of the map modernization study, it's before then, it's 2006. And so we just kind of brought that information forward, reevaluated against any erosion potential from the 2011 LiDAR data sets. But again, the primary frontal dune is more of a risk-based analysis and less of a topographic-based analysis. So I'm confused you probably.
Well, what changed? What changed? Why did the numbers all double?
Wave setup.
Wave setup
Yes.
changed? The waves used to be smaller?
No, so the wave setup is it's numerically determined in each one of the coastal transects, and that term gets added to the still water elevation.
Right. What used to happen that now happened? What changed what changed? Why is my house underwater now?
Okay.
What changed?
Yeah.
Excuse me, sir. What we want to do is get through the presentation and do question and answer after that we get through with that so that we can do the presentation, and then during that time, if you get the information, that's great. If not, we'll reserve that for Q&A after the presentation, please. Thank you.
So FEMA has understood that there's a lot of new information coming out to the public, and so they've developed some new outreach websites. And that's what this website represents. It's FEMA.gov/coastal-flood-risks. And when you go to that website, there's a lot of just kind of handouts. I mean, there's a lot of handouts that you probably saw today, which are much more related to the National Flood Insurance Program and insurance handouts. But for those who have interests, like me, about the engineering, you can go to these websites and you can kind of click and follow through and see what we analyze now and how it's being analyzed. And we provided this information to the communities before. We've given them web links as part of our CCO meetings. And so hopefully they've shared that on the websites. I'm not certain. I do know they've, of course, helped share where the data is available now online. But this is just kind of like an additional outreach. I want to talk now about the public review and appeal period. And as I want to go back to the slide, really focus on the 90-day appeal period, which we're in, which ends October 16th. So if anyone wishes to challenge the maps or make an appeal against the maps, you have this 90-day appeal period, which ends a month and a half from now. A little bit less. I'll kind of go through this now, but we really encourage community review. So these types of meetings, I appreciate what Marshfield and Scituate have done to host this event. It's the whole idea of getting out before the we engage community officials enough, but we don't engage the local homeowners. And so this is an opportunity for you to come take a look at the maps, see what flood zones you're in, and figure out why you're in those flood zones, or at least be able to ask those types of questions, and then work your way forward. And as I mentioned, the maps and data are available online. It's been very helpful that the towns have now been sharing that website, which is this preliminary flood hazard data. And so you can just click on this. You can access the maps themselves digitally. They're just PDFs, so they should be able to open in any web browser. Also, there's the flood insurance study report on this website, so you'll be able to actually see some of the study information that goes together. What is an appeal? That's the main question people ask. There is no official form you fill out. All that needs to happen is you have to provide scientific or technical data that shows new or revised base flood elevations, or ZAO and AO depths, or you may be able to just show revised SFHA boundaries. So you could show that, the first one is more about doing new engineering analysis to look at where is the base flood elevation fall, what is that number? And then the second one is much more about just contour-based information. You may be shown as being in an AE, or it may be an AE 17 or an AE 15, but you know the topography around your house is 22. So you go out and you get a local surveyor to come out, provide a new contour map, and you're able to show how the map actually should be such that the flood zone is defined around your house and not through your house. And so that's the type. There's two types of information we look for. One's the scientific technical data to change base flood elevations, and the second one is much more about just mapping based on better contour information. What we ask you do as part of that appeal process is we ask that it goes through the community officials, and then they can get sent to myself or FEMA. We do make the final review, but we encourage the community officials to at least know that there is a challenge or a change going on to their maps. And so it would just be, you run it through either, whether it be conservation or building officials, however, it would just come to us. We also look at comments. This is more, if the road name labels are wrong around your house, or if the flood zone name is wrong, like those types of comments. We do look at those. We want to try to improve the maps as much as possible. And so if you have those types of information, we do accept that as well. Quickly now, going over to the letters of map change. I have spoken to quite a few individuals who've brought in their elevation certificates, that type of information. We do what's known as a summary of map actions. So letters of map changes are referred to as map actions. That could be elevation certificates, having your home out as shown, or even if you did a more detailed engineering analysis at your property level and made a letter of map revision. At every level of the study, we're required to go through the complete library of letters of map changes throughout the communities and then define them into a summary. And so what we do is we look for categories 1 and 2. Those are ones that we incorporate, or it's just too small to incorporate, such as the out as showns. We can't draw the line enough around the house, or we can't just put a little circle around the house as being out of the floodplain. So we do that evaluation. The other one that we do is category 3. Those are the superseded. And so when we supersede them, we're basically saying that we made a comparison against the base flood elevation information that's in the letter of map change versus the new engineering analysis, and we've shown that those numbers are too low in comparison against the base flood elevation, and so it's superseded. And so what you want to do is go ahead and try to find the summary of map actions through the community officials. If you have a letter of map change, see where you are standing. Just make sure that you're kind of incorporated or accounted for. It's definitely something to look into. You don't want to find out about this information too late, like once the maps go effective. So we've done this now preliminary. We also do this right before the maps go effective. So right around about 2 weeks before the maps go effective, we issue what's known as revalidation letters. And so these revalidation letters are, if you were category 1 or 2, it's basically a way of saying your letter map change is still active, it's still effective. We've made a comparison and it's still a valid thing, so you don't have to issue a new one. And the problem is it doesn't come to you as a homeowner. It's only going to come to the community officials. It will be also in the map service center, and then the state and the region do receive copies of the summary map or the reval letters. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bob Sauniers to talk about flood insurance.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Right. This is the difficult piece, and this is the piece that really everybody should know the implications and what's changed. Before we get started, I would just, for my own information, like by a raise of hands, how many insurance agents are in the audience? Great. Yeah, there's a few. Flood insurance is very difficult for them. I started in the flood program after a long time in normal insurance, and it's a very difficult product, so I definitely commend you for being at the meeting. We're also going to be doing some special training for insurance agents in Massachusetts that you know, we can talk with you one-on-one about. But then the next question I have is how many people in this group have homes that were built before 1975? Okay. How many of you have flood insurance policies already? Okay, that's most of you. That's good. How many don't? Okay. And then last but not least, how many people have homes that were built after 1975 that have flood insurance? Okay. So let me get started. We're going to approach this on three levels. Ordinarily, when maps change, we do a presentation to explain from an insurance standpoint what you need to know happens when maps change. But now we also have to deal with the changes to the program that were introduced by the Bigot Waters legislation that was enacted July 6th of 2012. And then, you know, hopefully at the end we'll kind of go over what might be some of your options, or what else you might need to know. What happens when the maps change? The first thing, and I mentioned this to the smaller groups that we were doing earlier, if you don't remember anything else, one of the provisions that Congress asked for FEMA to put into the flood program about 3 years ago, when all the mapping changes started to really accelerate, people who were being mapped into the high hazard flood zone for the first time were kind of caught off guard, and the request by lenders for insurance, etc., they didn't feel was an adequate time frame. So Congress asked FEMA to put in a rule that would help people who were getting mapped into a high hazard zone for the first time. So the rule that was put in was that, you know, so long as your agent can show the underwriter, the company person, that on the old maps you were not in a high hazard flood zone. That's the zones that begin with the letter A as in alpha or V as in victory. They could make out a preferred policy application, and you would be able to have a preferred policy for 2 years. The advantage of that would be preferred policies are not rated using elevations, so you wouldn't have to immediately go out and get an elevation certificate. And preferred policies are very low premium policies. So basically that rule has been extended. So the first thing that you should be concerned with as you find out, you know, both what flood zone I'm in now and what flood zone I will be in on the maps that will take effect next year, is that if this is the possibility that this is the first time the map next year that you're going to be in a high hazard flood zone, talk to your agent about getting a preferred policy right now. Policies go for 12 months. You'll have a 12-month really low premium policy, and by the time the maps change, then you might be eligible for 2 more years of the special preferred policy under that rule, which is still in effect. Then the next big thing when maps change that we get a lot of calls on, your lenders, your mortgage companies have a federal requirement that if the building that is securing the loan, and if the loan is backed by the federal government, if that building is in a high hazard flood zone, A as in alpha or V as in victory, they have to have a flood insurance policy to back it. That's their requirement. They don't really need to know flood maps or know how to deal with them, etc. They're not really into insurance either, nor should they be. So what they do is they hire flood zone determination companies. Those companies track when the FEMA maps change. And when they change, they go to their client lenders and they give them the zip codes of the areas that have had a map change. And then the bank gives them the addresses of their outstanding loans that are backed by the federal government. That determination company then goes to the FEMA maps enhanced with their software that they have, and they do an official determination for the bank. When the bank gets that flood zone determination and they're spread out, they start the day that the map takes effect. So that would be, in this case, it would be, June of next year. And then these flood zone determination companies will let them know for every one of their addresses whether it's in a high hazard flood zone or not. Most of them will not be, and they just file the form in with the loan documentation. But there are going to be some that they're going to be told that the building or the parcel is in a high hazard flood zone. The federal requirement for the lenders is, the banks, is that they then have to, the minute they know that the building is in a high hazard flood zone, they have to send you a 45-day letter that basically says that you need to provide them with a flood insurance policy. And if they don't have one by the 46th day, then their requirements say that they have to force place a flood insurance policy. That would be similar to what they would do if you let your homeowner's insurance policy lapse. But usually the policies that they get are significantly higher in premium. They're usually intended just to be in place temporarily until you can provide your own policy. So be aware that once the new maps take effect, it would be good for you to know what zone you're in now, what zone you're in on the new maps, so you can anticipate that letter. And if you have that, get that policy in place, the preferred policy in advance. The banks will accept that. And when the preferred policy extension rule comes out, it'll show both flood zones on there, and the banks will accept that as well. So that'll definitely buy you some time. The other thing is we talk a little bit about grandfathering rules normally when maps change. And we do that because basically there are definitely some benefits for getting a policy under certain circumstances before the maps change. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about Bigot Waters and some of the things that Bigot Waters has mandated FEMA to do by way of building back in subsidized premiums. So let's move on to that. One of the biggest things we're dealing with the Bigot Waters law that came into effect last year is that it was a mandate that people should pay premium that represents their true exposure. So we have definitely two situations in our NFIP program where people pay less and sometimes significantly less than they should. The first one, and maybe this is the most important, we'll come back to it. Older buildings definitely, pay less than they should on average. The concept there was that when the program started in 1968, by the time communities joined the program and had, even, just had the accessibility to a FEMA flood map, permits were given and houses were built, and without the guidance of the ordinances or the maps to help you not build in harm's way. So we basically give the older homes that were built before the community had a FEMA flood map, we give them a break two ways. One, they're not rated using elevation. So if you see the house that is built along the river or along the coast that has the basements with the very lowest floor, under the current program prior to Bigot Waters, they did not have to be rated using elevation. They could be if they wanted to voluntarily, if that gave them a lower premium. So that was one break. That now that's a break for the people who have basements, who have really lowest floors. There could be people that on these older homes that they're built on a slab that might be above that 1% line where maybe they'd be better off being rated using elevation. But at any rate, no elevation was used. But then in addition, that group of policies, the older homes not rated using elevation, their rates were just straightforward subsidized. It started out with a 40% subsidy, and I believe over the years they built some of that back. But there might be a 30% missing premium level there that is just not charged to that group because that's how the program was set up. So that's the, and we're going to come back to that. That's the biggest group, and we have a lot of the older homes. I kind of use 1975 when I asked that question. A lot of the communities on the South Shore, you know, had their maps sometime in the, you know, in the 70s. You know, so each community could have their date might be a little bit different, but generally, if your home was built before 1975, then you're usually considered to be one of these pre-FERM, and FERM is just an acronym for flood insurance rate map. The second type of lower premium, which isn't going to be affected yet, is what the congressman referred to as the grandfathering rules. There's two types. You know, one is kind of a loyal customer. You know, you've kept continuous coverage. So when you bought the policy, you were in a particular flood zone, or it might have been subject to whether it was a high hazard flood zone or just a moderate flood zone. If it was high hazard, it might have been subject to a particular 1%, what we call the base flood elevation that was used for rating. Basically, under the grandfathering rule, loyal customer, as long as you kept on renewing your policy without a lapse in coverage, it would continue to be rated using the flood zone or the base flood elevation that was in effect on the maps that were in effect when you bought the policy. If you let that policy lapse at any time, then you lost the grandfathering. The second concept, again, was built a little bit on fairness, was it's called built-in compliance. And this type of grandfathering, if after the community was obviously in the program and had an ordinance and had flood maps, you built the house new or you substantially improved it, and you built it to meet the specifications of the floodplain ordinances at that time when they permitted it, and you did everything, you know, that you know had to be done, should be done. The way the program looked on that was that either you or whoever happened to be own the policy, we allow that policy to be rated using the zone and the elevation that was in effect at the time the property was built. Now, and we do require, though, that type of grandfathering isn't given unless the agent submits a letter from a community official that confirms that the house was built in such and such a year, that was the map that was in effect, and also they have to attest that you didn't substantially alter it along the way. So that's grandfathering, those two, loyal customer, built-in compliance. And those are not scheduled to be phased out until the end of 2014. We have to give an implementation plan, and the congressman mentioned that, you know, that could be impacted by current legislation. Let's get back to just again on the pre-FERM, these older buildings. That's taken effect right now, 2013. The first impact, and some of you have felt it, older buildings that were not your principal residences. So whenever you first bought that policy, even if it was 20 years ago, one of the questions was, is this your primary residence? And if you answered that question no, and that's been on their file ever since, basically starting with January 1st of this year, you would start to see some fast-paced increases on your renewal premium to start bringing that subsidized premium that we referenced, the possibly 30% back into the policy. The legislation itself allowed 25% increases for the next 4 years for the non-primary. I'm not sure if they're actually getting the full 25, but the legislation allows for it. The second and maybe more important phase, because it involves more policies, starts with renewals. And again, at this point, we're just talking about renewals. You already have a policy. That these older policies, starting with the October 1st, 2013 renewals, if you are a severe repetitive loss policy, and I think there's a little over 200 in the whole state, but there might be, definitely along the coast some. One, you would know if you were in that category of severe repetitive loss. That's a policy that's had frequency and severity, and you get a letter and you're told that you're in that category. If you're an older home and you have an existing policy and it's not rated using elevation, starting with the October 1st renewals, you'll start to see 25% increases for the next 4 years. Buildings used for business. Now, there's still a lot of voluntary private flood insurance available for commercial buildings. So a high percentage of our book isn't necessarily, business occupancies, but we absolutely, have business buildings on our book. So if it's an older building and they have an existing policy and it's non-residential, then starting with the October 1st, 2013 renewals, they'll start to get a 25% increase for at least the next 4 years. All other older buildings that have policies, so you don't have a severe loss, repetitive loss situation, or you're not commercial, they are going to start loading in the subsidies starting with the October 1st, 2013 renewals. And for example, as of October 1st, 2013, if you're in an AE zone, the rates are going to go up about 16%. 5 of that is to start building a mandatory reserve fund that the law calls for, and 11% is to start feeding back in subsidized premium. If you're in a VE zone, it's going to be a 17%. So it's same 5% to start the reserve fund, and the balance is to start loading back in the subsidized premium. And last but not least, because this kind of leads into what I think is a situation that definitely people should be aware of. If you have an existing policy not rated using elevation on an older home, and you let the policy lapse, so in other words, policies, you have 30 days after the actual expiration date that if you pay the premium in full, it'll get reinstated, even if you've had a claim all the way back to the expiration date. But if you pay the premium, on the 31st day, then there'll be a gap in coverage. And under the Biggert-Waters rules that are in effect now, you would then have to be treated as new business. And anybody who has an older home that has never had a policy or had one that has lapsed, they are going to have to be rated using elevation. What that means is that, you could still get the insurance, but that flat rate that didn't matter whether you were 12 feet below that 1% line or 12 feet above, now you would have to be rated based on your actual exposure as measured by an elevation certificate. Elevation certificates are done by licensed land surveyors or engineers. They measure key elevation points in the building. They also capture where the 1% flood is going to come in based on the map that's in effect when they do that elevation certificate. And then it's used for 2 purposes. The underwriter will use it to rate the policy, and then community officials use the elevation certificates to see that you're in compliance with the building ordinances. And again, that's everything I've been talking about right now has to do with older buildings that are not rated using elevation. If you already have a policy that is rated using elevation, we don't anticipate that those rates are going to go up much. It might have an increase to start building in that reserve fund I talked about. But if you're already rated using elevation, then, the type increases that usually come in reflect cost of materials, labor, or if we get new data that would show otherwise, that we should be charging more. So let me just, I think knowing, and we've given you a lot, but knowing some of the things that are happening, especially with the older homes, you know, I think one of the things we wanted to talk about was that, you know, first and foremost, you know, if you can, when you can, know your building's flood zone and elevation, even if it's not required for your actual rating of your policy, because where your lowest floor is has a lot to do with, you know, with the safeness, you know, of both your family, etc. So regardless of insurance, you know, we encourage you to know what your risk is, whether you agree or disagree with, you know, with the maps. The next thing is that if you are an owner of an older home, consider getting an elevation certificate to find out where that lowest floor is. You know, if you already have a policy, you are not going to be forced to get one. You're not going to be forced to, you know, to have to be rated using elevation. But at some point, these continual renewal increases that are going to be coming in to build back in the subsidy, we don't know, you know, what your real exposure is. If you happen to be somebody that, oh gosh, if you're 2 feet above, built in a slab, then you might want to, you know, definitely just, you can voluntarily be, you know, asked to be rated using elevation, and it'll be a much better premium for you. And conversely, if you have one of the situations where you are significantly below that 1% flood elevation, I think you need to know that, so that going forward, you know, you're making financial decisions. I mentioned I got most of my friends are in that situation where they have coastal property, but they've paid off their mortgage. And some of them aren't as tuned in as you folks, that the rules have changed. And some of them are looking to sell their property and maybe use the proceeds to permanently, you know, go down to Florida. They have to know that the person that's going to buy the house, you know, might really look closely at what's the impact of the flood insurance. So they need to know, are they in a high hazard flood zone? Maybe they don't know. They need to know that. And then secondarily, it would be great if they actually knew what their exposure was based on an elevation certificate. We talk a little bit about talking with your insurance agents. What I find is some people have had flood insurance policies for 20 years. And sometimes whoever the original agent was maybe didn't give all the right information. You know, ask your agent to, you know, to have the underwriter review your policy. Is there any additional information they might be able to give that might qualify you for some grandfathering? Remember, grandfathering is still in play until it starts to get phased out at the end of 2014. And it won't be a stop dead, no more grandfathering for the people that have policies. It'll be a phase out. The other part too that I run into is, consider can the building be adapted to meet or exceed current floodplain ordinance requirements? We had a meeting down at Scituate almost a year ago where, and she might even be in the audience, one of the gals said she had elevated her home a couple of years ago and was mentioning to the audience, you know, that how good she felt because, one, it didn't cost as much as what she had been told, but more important, she had 2 flooding events in the neighborhood since she elevated, and the peace of mind of the water going under the house instead of through her kitchen, you know, she said she couldn't put a price on. But I did ask her, I said, well, gee, could you tell the group of what happened with your insurance? She goes, oh yes, no, I think, and I might have the numbers a little wrong, but the difference is probably correct. I think she said, well, I was paying $3,200 and now I'm paying $800 a year. So not everybody has the means to do that, but there's other instances. You might be in a V zone as in Victory. Maybe you're totally in compliance. Well, maybe the ordinances allow you to have an enclosure underneath, so long as it has breakaway walls and isn't more than 300 square feet. Well, the underwriters still look on anything below a house in a V zone subject to wave wash as being something that can possibly take the whole house down and also damage, you know, neighboring structures with the debris. So if you have an enclosure, even though it's perfectly legal, you might have the opportunity, talk with your agent, you might be able to save yourself $1,000 a year, you know, if to reconstruct that a different way. But it's your choice, but as long as you know, probe all of these options. And we've got an example, and this certainly only applies if you're being rated using elevation, but we just wanted to show you the spread of risk for anybody, you know, anybody who is considering maybe elevating. But this is in an AE zone, so for a house with a lowest floor, that BFE is base flood elevation, that's what we call that 1% flood line. So if you're 4 feet below, the annual premium was $9,500. If they had built the house or adapted it so that the lowest point was right at the 1% line, it's $1,410 a year. Now here's the kicker. If they had built it 3 feet above, the premium would be $427 a year. The difference in premium as you get higher than those, the base flood elevation point, dramatically can drop. So there could be major savings that, you know, if that's one of your options. Then, you know, just to recap everything, you know, first and foremost, you know the maps are there, know how to access them, know what your current exposure is, because this is probably the best science that we have with the budget we're given. Even if you disagree with it, you should know about it.
No, it's not.
No, so we'll come back to that
No,
later.
well, let's get to questions.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
Sir, if you keep interrupting, I'm going to ask to have you leave. We really want to get through it. Just give us a chance to get through the presentation. We're just about there.
Okay. So at any rate, just in summary, consider, you know, finding out what your actual elevation is. You know, there's definitely, don't let your policies lapse if you already have one. There's some circumstances where these maps haven't taken effect that if somebody gets the insurance policy now, they could get an extra year of a preferred policy. I mentioned earlier, you know, definitely if you have a policy until this all plays out, please don't let it lapse. And we talked a little bit about if you have that option, then consider, you know, adapting in some way. Basically, we have these sheets were handed out there at a bunch of the table. We wanted to give everybody the contact information. My name is under FEMA Region 1 contacts on the bottom. You'll see my email address, and I'd like to bring to your attention Tom Young, who was here, the other insurance specialist, is the manager for the National Flood Program for New England, so his contact information is there as well. So, you know, individual questions, you know, if your agent can't answer them, etc., then you know, we're there. And these are just, again, these were on that same handout sheet there, the Map Service Center. A lot of information.
Okay, folks, before we get started with the question and answer, I have two town officials that one town official and a state representative, Jim Cantwell, and I'd like to, they wanted to ask a question first, so, Jim. And after that, Paul.
Paul, you go first? We're taking our turns. Steve, thank you very much, and thank you for all of the patience of folks here to hear the presentation. Thank you to the FEMA representatives. I do want to start by thanking some folks who are in the audience. Congressman Lynch, thank you very much for coming. There's some things specifically I want to ask of you. I have a few questions for FEMA, but I have a statement first. But to start, Congressman Lynch and Congressman Keating, people should know they both have co-sponsored legislation that will be addressing many of the concerns that we're going to talk about tonight. And indeed, Senators Warren and Senator Markey. Senator Warren has a staff member here, Stephanie Houghton. Senator Markey has a staff person here, Patrick Lally. State Senator Hedlund has his Chief of Staff, Ted Langell, is here. This would not have happened, this meeting, if it wasn't for Congressman Keating making sure that this took place in our district so that our two towns, my two towns, could be able to have this opportunity. So I thank you very much. So, before I get to my questions, for a statement, if I may, Marshfield and Scituate officials have done a tremendous amount of work for us to be able to understand this tremendous challenge and to try to react to it. As for our FEMA representatives, when we get to ask our questions, I disagree strongly with their analysis, but we have to extend them courtesy tonight. We want to hear these things so we can educate ourselves and do our best job to try to defend ourselves. I disagree with this policy. We're going to talk about reasons why I think the act did overreach, but we've already heard from the congressman of efforts that are going to try to correct some of those. So please, when we have our questions, we just were given their contact information. Even though we disagree and I'll have a few questions, I appreciate you coming tonight and I appreciate the information. First, for a statement, for Marshfield and Scituate being leaders in flood mitigation, Congressman, you would know now that you're representing this whole area, we appreciate that fact, but Marshfield years ago was only one of 2 communities in this entire state and only 1 in 13 communities in this country that were selected to be a project impact community because we did such a tremendous job getting prepared for flood mitigation. There's a woman here, Doris Crary, is going to ask some questions later on. Scituate right now is only one of 6 towns in this state that have a preferred rate, a community rating system where the great work Scituate's done is giving people a reduction in their flood insurance. Andre Martachini is here, former selectman from Duxbury, working with our town leaders. We have a regional study that was done as we're preparing for increases in sea level rise in 25, 50, 75 years. We're not ignoring this issue. We're working really hard on it. And as an example, Marshfield has spent now over $10 million just in the last decade on seawalls, $4 million just in the last year. Scituate just did an override to work on seawalls. The state just provided $20 million for seawalls, and I'm looking out here at others for removing dams to try to address with flood mitigation. And Governor Patrick was just here in February, looked at the devastation and said, we need to do more. He's looking for $125 million to do work for seawalls to prevent flooding. All of these things should help us, Congressman, as you had said, should help us in our rating system. Every single one of those measures, FEMA says they will not consider. We need a legislative fix because they're saying the seawalls won't be considered when we're trying to have our flood rates that are done, and I think that's an oversight. We definitely need to address that. Despite all these efforts, we are... Okay. Despite these tremendous efforts, Congressman, and you had staff at a meeting just last week, we had some experts, and I'm going to summarize it because there's a handout that I had. Congressman, we had people here for citing our state concerns of what this would do. We had State Rep Josh Cutler here, Bob DeLeo's office, the Speaker, Senate staff, Therese Murray, the Senate President, Garrett Bradley, Tom Coulter. We spoke in unison how we were concerned that these legislative changes would be disastrous for our communities, and in fact, it's impossible to overstate how terrible this could be. So we talked to town leaders who were here, went one by one talking about how if we lose the values of our properties, what that's going to do to this whole community, how the loss of tax revenues will jeopardize police, fire, teachers, and the like. Congressman, we had a number of our DPW directors and our town engineers who said, and I'll get to one of my questions on that, they said they think that they got it wrong as it relates to base and elevation, as it related to, in fact, in Marshfield, lived here my whole life, Matt McDonough knows this, part of the presentation from the gentleman here was saying that we were looking at, in the prepresentation, they thought we get 3-foot waves in Marshfield Center, lapping at Marshfield Center, which is about 5 miles inland. Those concerns, those things concerned our town leaders greatly, and both towns were incredible in having folks who were here, their building inspectors, who noted in the past, Congressman, and the FEMA folks knew this, in the past, our town building inspectors would meet with the folks before the new maps were done. For whatever reason, I know there are a lot of change, but that kind of cooperation didn't happen. I do appreciate they did, FEMA folks, in fairness, they came and gave preliminary maps back in the spring, but they weren't giving us the elevations. We didn't have the base elevations. Marshfield didn't get the maps with the assumptions until last Monday. Scituate just got them 2 weeks ago. We just don't have enough time. It took 3 years for FEMA to get these maps together. We're given less than 90 days to respond. We need the help. We discussed at that meeting, we had real estate concerns. Carol Conway Bowman, who's the CEO of Jack Conway, Steve Webster is the owner and president of Success Realty, Liz Charlton, who's here as a realtor. They spoke about the precipitous loss that we would have in values of our property if this policy went unchecked and unmitigated. We had bank concerns. We had 2 banking leaders. Joe Norton, a former Scituate selectman, who was also with Rockland Trust, Bill Bowers, who is the Hingham Institute of Savings, said having this policy come in without a change could trigger an entire new foreclosure crisis, where people would say, we just can't pay these new rates. We had business concerns. The gentleman here, you did a wonderful job presenting about how one person had saved some money by elevating their home. We had here, Congressman, in town, we have a business, Haddad's, spent $3.3 million last year to improve their business. They had the old FEMA maps, they went beyond what was required. They were required to go elevation 11. They went to flood elevation 13 to be beyond that to have a savings. They now are being told, despite spending $3.3 million, the third largest employer here in Marshfield, they now are being told, we're sorry, we've redone the maps a year later, you're now flood elevation 16. It's going to cost them approximately, they think, some $25,000, $30,000 a year. So I'm going to, there's a handout that I have for folks so you can see, but I'll get to my ask, Congressman, and you already have done this, so we're very grateful to you and Congressman Keating for already co-sponsoring this. So everybody, there is hope for this process because our congressmen, our senators already are hearing from you, and you being here tonight helps them greatly as well. The ask is to freeze implementation of this act, specifically until there's a comprehensive study for all of the financial implications. Congressman Lynch just told you about it. Before this was supposed to take effect, FEMA with the National Academy of Sciences was supposed to do a study that would say, what will the financial implications be? That was supposed to have been done by last March. For a lot of, they have sequestration, they have other issues happening in Washington, they don't have the money. That study hasn't been done. This new act should not be implemented until that study is done. You're already co-sponsoring that, Congress. You're already doing that. We need significantly, Rob Procaccino, the town engineer from Marshfield, was talking of the need to have peer review of each of these flood map determinations. Let me get to that, because there's an assumption. The young gentleman here did a very nice job, and we met just a little over a week ago, and I appreciate the information. But for still water elevations, to get to one of my questions, you guys, I only have two main ones, and I want other people to get to theirs. But when you get a chance, one assumption for still water elevations, Congressman, you and I both just heard the gentleman say here now, that it's somewhat imperfect data because, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but you said we had data from Boston that was discounted because you thought it was too far away. Woods Hole thought it was too far away. So they made assumptions. And I get worried about those assumptions because the still water elevations need to be peer reviewed. We're afraid they got it wrong. And here's why I spoke at length just this week with Alyssa Cummings, who is the engineer for Brick Township in New Jersey. She did work down there, and they were able to present and show that the still water elevation was wrong. They went from having some 8,000 homes that they had in the velocity zone. People were going to have to pay a tremendous amount of money. Their maps are being redrawn, Congressman, because of that. And so my first question to FEMA folks, you want to write them down, and then we can do right after I'm done. First question, is it true that FEMA has redone maps for Brick Township and Toms River in New Jersey based upon an error in analysis on still water elevation? That's question number one, if you know. Congressman, the part of our request that we're getting to is needing time so that we can actually be able to challenge those assumptions. My second thing you've already heard me discuss is how it took 2 to 3 years for those maps to be done. We only have the 90 days. We need to extend our time so we can get it together. We just, in order for town meeting in Marshfield to Scituate, for our town leaders who are busting their chops working on this, for them to be able to do something, they have to first put out a request for proposals to look for engineering work, do the scope of work. After that's done, that takes about 30 days. Then they have to put a warrant out there if they have to spend money. So they have to do a special town meeting. That takes another 30 days or so. Then they have to get a town meeting vote. Then they have to hire the person. Then the work has to be done. It just isn't feasible for towns to be able to act that quickly. So that's why we need the help. And the final request, Congressman, is this gentleman was talking of how, right here, how we used to have built-in compliance grandfathering. The gentleman was very kind talking about a hypothetical or a real story of a young woman or a woman in Scituate who spent all that money to be able to elevate her home and that she was going to be able to save some money. Unfortunately, if we eliminate, Congressman, if through this act, if we eliminate grandfathering for built-in compliance structures, people like Chuck Haddad and people like that woman, the people who spent a lot of money to comply with the law at the time are now going to be thrown into the old system. They're now going to be below elevation. They're going to spend a lot of money. So we need your help, Congressman. In closing, thank you very much to all the officials here from Marshfield and Scituate for putting this together. Congressman Keating, thank you, the staff of Jim Quigley for getting this all together. We appreciate everyone knowing that we have Senator Warren's office here, Senator Markey's office here. Congressman, you've done a great job already. We appreciate your particular time. Thank you so much. Everyone, when we have questions tonight, though, again, remember the courtesy. We want to learn from these folks. They're given a job. We need the information, but I'd ask everyone to be courteous. I disagree with their analysis. Let's be courteous with our questions, however. Thank you very much.
Okay. So when you come up for questions, and please go ahead and start to come to each mic for the questions. We just ask that you give your name and address. The other thing that I do want to answer one of those questions regarding how the analysis was done for New Jersey, and we don't have that information. The other thing that I do want to make sure is in asking the questions, what we have up here is a panel of experts for the process that is put into place. We can't change the process and we can't change the act, but we can certainly tell you how it's being implemented and the questions that can help you make some informed decisions. And that's why we're here. But please don't get frustrated if you begin to ask questions about why isn't it this and why isn't it that. I think it's great that some of these questions were referred to the congressman and the staff of the Congress that are here, because that's where some of these questions do need to go. So hopefully with that, we can answer your questions. And I also do want to say that after the Q&A, we will, and I know that there's still some folks back in the cafeteria with the maps, and we will, all of the experts that are here on the panel will be back in the cafeteria after the Q&A. So hang on just one second. I want to be able to get the mic over so that everybody can hear the answers to the questions. Okay, so we'll start with the left here with the first question, and please give your name and address.
Hi, my name is Bob Bose. I live at 1090 Ocean Street, and it's a privilege to live in Marshfield. I grew up in Brockton, and I'm glad I'm in Marshfield. I hope I can stay here. The question is, in 1998, we bought the home, and I wasn't in a flood zone. You revised the flood zone in 2006, put me in a flood zone. Now in 2013, you're revising it again. My home was built in 1931. And I have a document here from you folks. There has never been a loss. There has never been a loss at 1090 Ocean Street in the history of your records. So how can you keep changing these elevations? And another question, it's a two-part question. This might be directed at Bob. I appreciate you going over what you did, but in 2008, my flood insurance was X amount. And in the last 5 years, it's gone up 65%. Why? There's never been a loss.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll start with the elevations, Brian.
The two changes, so 2006, that tended to be, if you kind of go back to the slide I had that showed the history of coastal floodplain analysis, prior to 2006, there have been a lot of new approaches that have been defined and needed to get into place. Those engineering work actually began in around the 2003 timeframe. And then the new mapping goes back to Congress initiating the risk map program, wherein they told FEMA to update 100% of the coastal floodplains. And so the Marshfield Scituate area received a new engineering analysis, and there was a whole bunch of new engineering approaches that got added into the base flood elevations at that point in time.
Maybe you're wrong. Right here, here's the document from you folks. No loss. No loss at 1090 Ocean Street in the history of you folks keeping a record.
Yeah, the individual loss history at this point doesn't come into the premium. It's partly because it's the nature of the you know, we cover a catastrophic peril. So, you know, unlike automobile insurance or even homeowners where you have more frequency with all the different perils, at this point they have not built in a factor that would alter the premium based on your loss history. That's just the way it is. I wish I could give you a better answer.
Am I correct in saying that you folks want us folks in Marshfield, Duxbury, Scituate to pay for everybody else's losses? And let me tell you something. This is a true fact. I know some folks that live in Halifax and some people in Hanson. About 2 springs ago, there was a lot of rain, and their finished basement got flooded. Now, they didn't have flood insurance, but they got money from FEMA. They got my money, and I'm upset.
Okay, so in answer to your question, the National Flood Insurance Program, the premiums are established based on historical data throughout the country. And so it takes in not only catastrophic events such as Katrina and others, but it does take in other events. Sir, we've gotten 4 questions. Can we
Okay,
move
I'm
on to
sorry,
something
but I don't
else?
want to keep paying for everybody else.
I understand.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir?
Alex Alvarez, 53 Collier Road in Scituate. So it seems a big part of the problem here is these maps that don't make much common sense and aren't very realistic. When the process was laid out, it seemed like there was a point in it where we had to vote for the map. What happens if we don't vote for the map?
If the town does not adopt the map, then
Correct.
we cannot be in the National Flood Insurance Program.
So then we don't have to pay insurance anymore.
That's correct. A town can make that choice, absolutely. Sir?
My name is Jeremiah Eck. I live at 227 Bay Avenue. I'm an architect by profession, so I guess you could call me a practical guy. What I wonder about is the practical reality. For instance, let's say Green Harbor is currently at elevation 9 and is listed on the new maps of elevation 16. I somehow can't bring myself to imagine that a 7-foot difference has occurred in whatever period of time. And, you know, I certainly am not here to deny sea level change. I think it's a scientific proof that it has occurred. But how, from a practical point of view, can you justify, in that one instance, for instance, a 7-foot change in elevation?
Right.
That one is actually, it's relatively easy to define. So if you go to the one slide where I was showing the effective stillwater elevations are actually what we put in place. So it kind of goes back to even the question that Representative Campbell asked about this starting stillwater elevations. Those are what are in effect right now. So those are numbers that were decided back in 1988 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers developing return period elevations. So that was the risk that we used to communicate back in the day. The new term that we have not been putting onto the maps, but we have now been asked to put on the maps, is that wave setup term. And so that term is what's driving, you know, if I'm using the old stillwater elevations and we're seeing changes in floodplains, then it's due to the inclusion of the new term, which is the wave setup term. And that was something that it's not on any of the maps anywhere. It's just now being rolled out into Region 1. So we started mapping in Connecticut, did Rhode Island, we're now in Massachusetts. And so all of these maps are now getting this wave setup term added to the risk component. It was something we just hadn't mapped before, and it's now the new way we're supposed to communicate the risk.
I would just say one follow-up. I would hope that FEMA would consider the One follow-up. I hope that FEMA would consider the practical reality of what you're doing here. My own house is elevation 13, first floor level, under structure at 11, would have to be 5 feet higher to comply with the new. That means that everyone on my street, if they built a new or tried to fulfill the insurance requirements that this gentleman is talking about, would be on stilts 5 or 6, almost a story high. That seems, from a practical point of view, from what is now, from the history that I know in the area, to be unrealistic. So I'm just asking that, you know, it's perhaps my viewpoint is not scientific, but it seems practically unrealistic. Thank you.
Gentleman over here to my right.
Thank you. Joe Rossi, 41 Quail Run, Marshfield, also with the Marshfield Citizens Coastal Coalition. As a coalition, we're going to make an attempt at an appeal with these maps in Marshfield. But there's some information that we need first before we can make that move. The first question I have is, we've talked to a couple different people at different, both at NFIP and at FEMA, and heard a couple different definitions of what you consider a basement when basing your elevation off of. Can you just clarify for us, first of all, what a basement is considered?
I'm going to have Chris Markusich answer that, please.
For the National Flood Insurance Program, a basement is considered a floor that is below grade on all sides for building compliance. So if you walk into the front door of the house and you step down and the bottom floor is below the grade on the outside on all sides, then that's considered a basement.
So in the case of Marshfield, where we have a lot of split level ranches, that bottom floor is now considered a basement.
Yes.
The next question is, there's been a lot of discussion in bigger waters about an increase of 25% on policies. What is the 25% based off of? Is that a number that FEMA has determined as actuarial, or is that a number that already exists in the policy?
It's a number that was actually put into the bigger water statute, and it wasn't meant to apply to all houses. They identified, for instance, the older homes that are not primary. They felt that the subsidized premiums should be put back into them at a faster pace than somebody's primary home. So they put in there in the act that could increase 25% for the next 4 years. Severe repetitive loss policies, they would increase 25% each year. This is assuming they're not rated on elevation. And then buildings that are primarily used for commercial purposes. So those are the categories that would get the 25%.
So I guess what's important is the number that was in bigger waters available yet to base that 25% off of?
It's going to start with the October 1st rates, which should be published any day now. They'll be accessible to the public and everybody.
Because I believe I got an email with those numbers in it. I didn't know if they had been released today or not.
Yeah, what they did is they have sent the numbers out to the insurance companies in advance so they could get programmed, but there's a public site that anybody can go on to, and you can actually see the rate manual.
Okay. One last question. In our attempt to appeal the maps, we were given a criteria of easiest to hardest in terms of appealing the maps. The easiest way was to challenge the topography that was determined. The topography that we would like to challenge, is that the firm map topography or the LiDAR topography that was created to make the firm maps?
So it would be what you want to do is you want to be able to provide better technical topographic information than the LiDAR data that's used to make the firm map. So,
and what would that be considered, a site or plot plan?
Yeah, it's like the easiest thing to do would be to get 1 foot contour information, or even you could probably still go with 2 foot contour information that's specific to a property that can show where the floodplain falls against what was shown on the preliminary rate map.
All right. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Pat Crowley, 1249 Ocean Street. This is about the appeals process that he was just talking about too. You're giving us less than 90 days to do the appeal thing. How are we supposed to do this in a timely manner? Like if you said you can get a group of people from the area to do this, but you're talking about getting the topographic information. How do we get that in a timely manner? And if once we produce it, can it, does it hold off on the maps or whatever? How does that work?
So the way the process goes is, you would engage someone now, like I said, you can get a group together or whatever, and try to, at least defray the cost, do it contour-wise, and then look at topographic information, or if you want to even look at the engineering work that goes behind it. You just submit the information, and we expedite our review as much as possible to ensure, because we know the time-sensitive nature that we have, and so we try to work with the submittal or the submitter, and we try to get that all taken care of before the appeal period ends.
How do you get that topographical information though? And how long does that take to get?
The topographic information is actually, like if you wanted to get the LiDAR data, it is available from them.
I don't know what LiDAR data is.
So for those who aren't aware, the way the topographic information is collected, it's an aerial-based system. So they fly a plane over Scituate with a laser in it, and the laser is scanning the ground, and it's just getting ground surface returns. And so that LiDAR is then it's called LiDAR, light detection and ranging. And so they take that information and then process it into the digital elevation models and contour-based information. That's actually available from the MassGIS website. So you could download it that way. The other option is to go through FEMA, who would basically just authorize me to release it to you guys. And we use file transfer programs where we put the data up onto a server so that you can just pull it down and be able to access the data.
So you can do it pretty quickly and get in as long as we get a group together.
Yeah.
Go to our town committee, correct?
You don't even have to really go to town committee. I mean, you can just go as a group, a group of local neighbors. And it's, Bob had that contact list that he was showing. You'll kind of see, I think there's a bottom right box. You'll see submit appeals to me. My email address is on there as well, so just feel free to email me, and I'll go ahead and coordinate with you as best as possible.
Okay, they didn't have any more of those papers out front, so I don't know if they can get you.
We do. I know we try to share this with the community officials, but I guess we can leave this up in the background and people can write it down.
Okay. Another thing, I have a house at 1249 Ocean Street, which is now being in the flood zone, the AE zone, which has never been in it before. Explain to me, I don't understand this elevation 16 or 15 or 8. What does that mean? That if I have to elevate my building, it's got to be 16 feet off the ground? Is that what it's saying, or what does that mean?
No, the base flood elevation is actually provided with reference to a vertical datum. And for the maps, the vertical datum is the North American vertical datum of 1988. And so that's 0.
Okay.
Which is basically mean sea level back in 1988. And so that 16-foot value says that it's 16 feet reference to mean sea level in essence. And so it's not 16 feet above the ground. You would actually get your local ground elevation at maybe 12 or 13. And if the VFE is 16, then it just says that there's kind of goes back to the rating components. If you built in compliance with the base flood elevation, you could be 3 feet off the ground and you get a certain rating. If you build higher, it's something else. If you build below, it's something different.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Next.
Hi, Mayor Jenkins, Scituate, Mass, Scituate Coastal Coalition, and Scituate Seawall Committee. My first question is relation to something Jim Cantwell had talked about with seawalls, but I am referring to the jetties of Scituate Harbor and why those were not considered as water impediment into the harbor. They just were left out of the calculations. And I know Brian answered it earlier, but...
Yeah, I can do it for the public. So when FEMA looks at any coastal structure, or any structure for that matter, that could potentially provide protection against the 1% chance floodplain, it needs to be certified. And I think Jim Cantwell had spoken on that as well earlier, and I think even Representative Lynch had brought it up as well, about just the fact that any coastal structure that we look at, if we wanted to provide protection against the floodplain, it needs to get certified. And if we have no certification information, then we have to assume that the structure is failed and we do not consider it in our analysis.
The issue that I'm dealing with in Scituate is that the Army Corps of Engineers built those jetties, but the Army Corps of Engineers does not certify their jetties any longer. And that was something that you said, Brian. So here we are in a catch-22, and the congressmen here have got to figure this out, because these are structures that protect and have protected Scituate Harbor for decades. And now they're suddenly being obsoleted by somebody who decided on a piece of paper that they don't work. And I have a problem with that.
Go ahead.
Laurie Fudge, 18 Island Street. I was curious, how are you assessing our properties? On what we owe on the mortgage or the property value for the flood insurance?
We don't assess properties.
Then who does? Where's the 16% coming from? What does that mean?
As far as your flood insurance?
No, that didn't have anything to do with the value of the property. That was just an average rate increase that was going to come into play to start loading back in subsidized premiums that should have been charged, but previously had not been charged.
So what I'm getting at is our flood insurance only covers our houses, not the land, not our pools, not our sheds. Are we going to be charged on those too?
No.
Is it just going to be the property?
You select the limited coverage, and it's supposed to apply to your building. And that's really what's subject to the rating factors. So anything that's not, outside the land or anything, that doesn't come into play at all.
Okay, and if we have this delayed, do you still plan on retroacting it back to June of 2012?
I don't know. Until they come out with the implementation plan at the end of next year, and how they decide to do that, I don't know. So all I know is that until we see what the implementation plan is, I can only speculate, and therefore I really don't want to.
I just don't know how you can retroactive something when no one knew about it.
Yeah, I understand.
Hi, my name is Meg Good. I live at 208 Bay Ave. I also own 2 rental properties, one at 201 Bay Ave and the other at 25A Bay Ave in Green Harbor, Marshfield. And I understand that you've done all this scientific research on what you think is going to happen to the area. And as we all know, scientific research can be wrong. And I not only live directly on the water, I also live directly across the street from Cut River, which is a tidal river. Not once have I had the water come up to my property. I've never had to move a car. I've never put in a claim, and we don't have any water problems. We don't have any flooding problems that you need to raise my insurance rates. I don't understand it. Base it on real world. Base it on what my experience is, not what you think is going to happen.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, Steve Mark, Marshfield. I had a couple quick ones. First, I'd like to clarify a statement that was made previously with regard to what happens if we don't vote in the maps. It's not that you don't have to participate in the insurance program. You can't participate in the insurance program, but everyone who has a mortgage still has to have flood insurance. So people who think that's a good thing, we don't have to participate in the program, it's not, and it's a terrible thing. So it was kind of answered rather flippantly, I think. Secondly, I have a question with regard to the changes. With regard to, you talked about what happened if something was used as a vacation home, a second home. What happens if you said based originally it was as a vacation home with original policy application however many decades ago? What happens if that has changed over the years?
Okay, what I'd like to do, Rich, if you don't mind, if you could talk about joining or not adopting the maps, because I certainly didn't mean that as a flippant answer, but hang on just one moment.
Yes, I appreciate your clarification on that. You are indeed correct that the not having the availability of insurance would not be a good thing, because you would then have difficulty in obtaining a mortgage, you would potentially have to get an insurance on the private market through companies such as Lloyd's of London that would be much more expensive than the rates you're seeing through the NFIP. But the other thing that a community has to be aware of when they decide whether to vote on whether or not to adopt the maps is that those maps will be in place for the purposes of the state building code, the Wetlands Protection Act regulations, and so forth. So any new construction that occurs, any significant or substantial improvements to existing construction would have to be built in accordance with those new maps, regardless of whether the community adopts it at town meeting or chooses not to do so.
But simply the consequences of not adopting the map so far are pretty egregious.
And then Bob, if you could address the insurance question.
Yeah, you should let your insurance agent know what the actual occupancy, of that home is, because like I mentioned, if you've had the policy for a long time, they might have in the database that it's not your primary. So they will go back and fix that, but you're going to start by telling your agent that since such and such a point, it has been my permanent residence. Now our definition in the program is 80% of the year. So that would be the one thing they might ask you is, are you there 80% of the year?
Thank you. One final question. As was mentioned, a lot of assumptions are being made. It's hard to imagine a worse assumption than as was mentioned, that jetties don't exist or seawalls don't exist. I mean, what is the possible rationale? And if we just put in a brand new seawall in front of my house, it's 1.5 feet higher than what it was before. It's probably 1 foot wider than it was before. And from the purposes of this program, it doesn't exist.
Actually, for your seawall, it does exist, or at least it's considered as we make the maps. When we cut a transect and we look at the wave run-up, we're actually looking at that structure. The thing to realize is that the FEMA maps are a snapshot in time. So our topographic data is collected from the kind of winter time frame, 2010, 2011. In certain locations, we also send out survey crews. We know the importance that actually the floodplain is driven by coastal structures. So for revetments, seawalls, anything that's kind of on the shore or attached to the shore, we consider that as we're making our floodplain maps. We actually look at 2 different scenarios. We look at the structure intact, so that is in its current structure, and then FEMA has a methodology to evaluate failure. Basically what happens is the structure stays in place, but it just slopes down. And so, the wave run-up changes because you've got a different wave slope, but the frictional dissipation of the structure is still accounted for when we make the maps. The bigger issue are the bigger structures, so something that's out in the water, breakwaters. Those we have a very different approach to. We can't consider them if they're not certified. And that's why on your home structure, we look at that in the intact and fouled scenario because we don't have the certification. So we have to assume that there's a potential it can fail under the 1% chance storm event, and what would be the resulting floodplain if that were to occur. And then we look at those 2 analyses and we make a decision as to what's a more conservative map, and then that's what gets shown on the map. So we do actually consider them.
Okay, I have a specific question related to that you may not know the answer for. So you did include the new seawall. The elevation was actually dropped a foot on the ocean side of the seawall. There used to be a barrier between the seawall and the first part of the land that was 4 foot below the ocean level, or 5 foot below the ocean level. Now it's the same as the ocean level. So basically you're saying the elevation required, if I built it on the sand on the beach, is the same as required on the opposite side of the seawall. It really makes no sense.
I don't know. Get a little confused by your question. But, yeah.
Oh, well, I'm just basically saying that where I am at least, and actually almost all of Fieldston, the elevation requirement on both sides of the seawall is the same.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Which kind of makes no sense. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jack Sullivan. I live on Salt Meadow Way. First of all, I want to apologize. I did speak out earlier. I yelled out. I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. I appreciate everybody for being here, and I wish I didn't do that. Listen, I bought my house over 15 years ago. I moved down from Boston because my kids can't go to school up there. Listen, I'm going up to work another double. I work about 4 doubles a week. and I can't afford to put my kids in any youth sports except for the town youth sports. They're not going next year because the federal government, in its infinite wisdom, helped us out again. You're working your butt off, and I appreciate you for being here, Senator Lynch. I really do. You gave a very good, you're working very hard. You're working against the tide down there. They keep on passing these things. I wouldn't have bought my house where I bought. I live 5 miles from the beach. I can't see water. I see a hill between me and the beach about 2 miles away. Blizzard of '78 never touched my house except for snow and rain and wind. There's never been a wave anywhere near me. The no-name storm never got water. I've never had water in my basement once. The person who owned the house before me never had water in their basement once, we can tell. Then they said. We don't live anywhere near water, we never get water. But because I live on the, near Salt Meadow Way, it takes me about 15 minutes to drive to the beach, by the way. Because I live on Salt Meadow Way and there's marsh grass out there, you know, the elevation of Star Limited Partnership that FEMA hired, rather than using, you know, those slow folks at the Army Corps of Engineers, who thought that the elevation was 8 or something. Now Star thinks it's 15, and it's coming in my second floor, you know, window now. Listen, and I don't mean to be flip, I'm mad. I'm gonna lose $6,000 to $9,000 a year when I've never had a drop of water, and I'm never gonna, and you know I'm never going. It's phony. I'm going to ask a question and I'm going to leave. Where did Star come from? Why is it a limited partnership? I'd like to invest in it, I can't. I want to invest in Star. Okay, why does FEMA hire Star? Who's their competition? Why don't you use the Army Corps of Engineers? And what is this about the wave analysis? They had, you know, the Blizzard of '78, they had waves. They had waves, and they didn't touch my house. They had waves of the no-name storm, and I didn't see any waves. I live way far away from the beach. So this wave analysis is I've been waiting for over an hour and a half. For what is the difference? Like, you use a different calculator. What's the difference between what we knew to be the best information at the time 2 years ago and the best information of the time right now that the Army Corps of Engineers didn't know about 2 years ago? You say, now we were told to use the wave something. Who told you to use the wave something?
Okay, so...
So the wave setup term actually probably does come from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but it was, as I said, in the latest map updates didn't include it. They just looked at still water elevation, didn't account for wave setup, because at that point in time, that was the official methodology that FEMA had in effect. Then FEMA developed a focus group, Corps was part of it, there was other federal agencies involved, there was also academics involved, and they looked at what were we doing for the floodplains, how are we administering our risk, was it the proper risk to do? The decision was no, that we needed to account for this wave setup term. And so,
why?
So, wave setup is the most,
The tsunami?
no, so what happened, okay, so now it's gonna get technical. But as the waves are approaching the shoreline, there are shoaling effects, but as they interact with the bottom and the waves break, what ends up happening is that you have to end up having water rise on the shore to offset the amount of momentum flux that's coming in due to the wave breaking. And so as that's happening, then it elevates the water surface elevation. And it's, as I've mentioned, it's
But why didn't that happen in the blizzard of '78?
I'm sure it did.
Well, why didn't it touch my house? Why did it go from 8 outside my house to 15?
But that's not the 1% chance event. So FEMA's flood maps are not, they're not a
So this flood, my insurance is not going to be based on a storm how many times greater than the blizzard of '78? How many times greater than that storm am I protecting my house against? By law, by force of taking it from my family's bank account. By force of law. How many times greater than the blizzard of '78 am I protecting myself against?
That's a good
100 times greater? 50 times greater? Is it like a meteor, like a dinosaur go-away storm?
Okay, I just want to, I know, and I appreciate your remarks, and I think you've been very honest and probably introduced more common sense into this discussion than some others. Here's the view that I have, and I have a question based on all of the questions that have been asked here. Do you mean to tell me that with the questions about the level of elevation, which I think you're inviting them to use, the audience, the homeowners here from all these towns, you're asking them to use your data in their appeal, and that your data is available to them if they want to launch an appeal. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, I got a problem with that. So I think your data will reflect your data and not necessarily reflect, okay? So I think part of what my constituents are asking here is that they question your data because it is at variance at what the Army Corps of Engineers has determined in previous measurements. And they're a pretty crack operation, if you don't mind me saying. I work with them a lot, and I have great respect with them, for them. I do a lot of work on dredging with the Army Corps of Engineers. But the bottom line is this. So we are trying to give people a meaningful opportunity and meaningful due process in all of this. So there are issues that are being raised about the data, the acquisition of the data in terms of why is it now 16 feet, it used to be a lot less. So you're telling them that the seawalls or jetties have not been certified, so we're not going to take them into consideration. Their opportunity to challenge the maps that will, in some cases, affect a taking of these homes in some cases, that they've got 6 weeks. That they've got 6 weeks to come up with a meaningful challenge, which, look, in the legislative debate, they never said, oh, and by the way, we're going to set up this process, and in 6 weeks, your neighbors, who all have jobs and lives and obligations to their families, they're going to have to scramble in 6 weeks to overturn the assumption that their houses are going to be taken or they're going to be put into a flood zone map area that will require them to spend $10,000 a year on insurance. So what I'm saying is this: I have two options as someone who represents these families. Either I can ask you to extend the amount of time to a realistic amount of time to give us a chance to respond. That's one. Or there's got to be a legal recourse that we can have to get due process, because I don't feel that we're being given due process by FEMA in the current process. So I guess it's like this. We can either do this the hard way, or we can do it the easy way. And what I'm asking is a basic courtesy to the constituents of myself and Mr. Keating, and probably others as well, to have a meaningful opportunity, meaningful due process to go through. The 6 weeks is just too short. If I've had my whole staff working for 6 weeks on just this issue, forget Syria, forget everything else I've got to worry about, I could not meet this deadline. So we need to do a little team back here and figure out what would be a reasonable amount of time for communities to respond, to question the assumptions that have been made, to question their placement within certain zones on the map. And look, I know you're doing your best. I know that you got the data when you got the data, but all I know is that Jim Cantwell tells me he got his data Monday, and the folks in Scituate got it a couple of weeks ago. That's not nearly enough time to afford due process in all of this. So we need to back this up. We need to back this up to a point where we can actually have a meaningful opportunity for these citizens that we all work for, by the way, to have a meaningful opportunity to challenge them. I guess I don't need well, I'd like to have an answer tonight, but certainly by tomorrow, because, you know, I've got legal counsel in my office, and they will have to find out what the legal process is to stop this and to go in and get an injunction, you know, to just and we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. We just want to have a meaningful opportunity to work this through and to make sure that people are being treated fairly. Because they've got a huge investment in their homes. They've got their whole lives. This is serious business, and we don't want to take their concerns lightly. So, if we could come to an agreement on some extension, that would be great. Something that would be meaningful for them, and give us all an opportunity. I know there's some groups here that are already organized, and you know, that would be helpful for them as well. Okay? Thank you.
So a couple of points of clarification with all due respect. I'm Carrie Bogdan from FEMA Region 1. I'm the senior engineer. I oversee all of our mapping projects, so I manage Brian's team. The appeals period has not been 6 weeks. It's been a statutory 90 days as defined in the Code of Federal Regulations. Understood. Make my couple of points of clarification. So with regards to the towns getting the data on Monday, I would like to point out that this has been an engaged process. We did come out and deliver work maps to the communities back in April timeframe, March timeframe. Work maps which are draft, they show what the modeling results are showing. They're prior to the preliminary maps. And then those preliminary maps were developed, incorporating comments from communities, and released at the beginning of May. They're out there to the public. They're available on the FEMA website. I assure you, they're on there, the Map Service Center. Okay.
So the questions as far as the appeals period, we here, the staff that are here today, do not establish that. And so when I talked in the beginning about questions and what we could answer and what we could not, there are things that the people here cannot change, and the appeals period is one of them. So I understand, and I understand the frustration, believe me. We've been to many meetings, and but we don't have control over that. I think you have somebody here that can help you get that changed, but it's not on this side of the table. The experts that we have here that we've brought to the meeting tonight to answer your questions are based on the processes that are established that we cannot change. So we are still open here to ask further questions if you'd like to continue with the questions. Does everybody want to continue with the questions?
Come on, don't drag it out.
Thank you. I'm sorry to jump ahead. I'm Matt McDonough. I'm a member of the Board of Selectmen of the town of Marshfield. I had the opportunity to attend the FEMA meeting that Representative Cantwell spoke about a little while ago. We were in Boston. We had a large group from Scituate and Marshfield. And I do have a couple of questions about comments that were made at that meeting that haven't been brought up tonight. There was a discussion about LiDAR data at that meeting, and one of the points that was made by, I don't know if it was a STAR engineer or if it was Kerry, if it was you, but you spoke about the problem that LiDAR has, and we asked about weaknesses in LiDAR data, that there's a difficulty in detecting the difference between gutters and sand. And if you can expound upon that comment and explain about what those issues are.
Actually, I don't think it's not a LiDAR question. It's more, it's the printing of the maps. So gutters, nomenclature, that's the zone break. So it's that white line that you see that's delineating between glossy zones, AE zones, adjacent AE zones, adjacent glossy zones. On the ortho photos, so on those, the maps that we make, that white line and the sand look the same because the sand comes out as about a white line. So we've been seeing people having issues with actually being able to interpret the maps because they're not able to see these gutters, so they don't know which flood zones they're in. And that's just that's when we refer back to then that the map data itself, or the DFIRM database, which is a Esri product. You can actually look on that, and it shows you where your zone breaks are. So you can put that on like a plot map, and it doesn't have to be against the ortho photos. And so it should be easier to see gutters.
My apologies. What I took from the discussion that we had, and you've given me a different perspective tonight, but at the time it was that using LiDAR, you could not tell the difference between gutters and sand, and that seemed to be quite an important distinction when you're trying to judge whether or not the elevation of a house is at a certain height. You're saying that's incorrect. So it's just the coloration of the map. Okay, you did not share that with us at that meeting. Peer review is a question I have. You spoke about peer review and how you have peer review within STAR, and then the peer review of that data then goes to FEMA, who does their own peer review in-house. Is there any external peer review that's done on this data outside of STAR and outside of FEMA?
Aside from the methodologies, the actual study itself doesn't go through an external peer review.
One last question. It's actually kind of an observation and a question. You spoke about the work maps being available for several months. The fact is that our town has not been able to look at work maps that had plot lines that would allow our residents to make the meaningful choices they have to make about their financial future and the future for their real estate and their families. So when Rep. Cantwell speaks about not having the information that he needed as an elected official until this past Monday, I would back him up 100%. We did not have the data that was necessary to allow people to make these meaningful decisions. There were work maps available, and you were working with our communities, but, and I don't fully blame you for this, the timeline on this has been incredibly pressure-filled. We did not have the information in a timely fashion, in my opinion, to allow all of the people here and in our towns to make meaningful decisions about what they're going to do about the future of their real estate and essentially their families. Thank you.
Sir, over to my right, do you have a question?
Yes, Ian Seaver, 28 Gilson Road, Scituate. I just had a quick question on the conversion of the old datum to the new datum, so the old NGVD 29. So I have an elevation certificate for my house, and I'm just wondering how to convert that. Say it's 15 feet, for example. What does that equate to under the new datum?
The easiest thing to do is go to the flood insurance study report. You can get that on that website where all the maps are. It's 3.5, or it might be 4.0. It's called vertical datums. And in there, there's actually just kind of a paragraph that talks about what the conversion factor is from NEVD 88 to NGVD 29 and back and forth. And I don't know the number off the top of my head. It's somewhere on the order of 9/10 of a foot. But the actual number is reported in the flood insurance study.
Is it positive or negative though? So if I had 15 under my old thing, is my house going to be higher under the new one?
No, we'll go the opposite way. It's a 14-foot then.
Okay, thanks.
Sir?
Hi, my name is Derek Stack. I'm here on Arkansas Street, and I think we're all going through the same thing. As a younger family here, I'd like to stay here in Marshfield, keep the house. We're just throwing some ideas out that everybody's probably thinking the same thing for Jim, that as a community in John Hall, if we could extend the whole period, if we could somehow have everything a couple years down the road, reevaluated once the seawalls are to a higher elevation, and also for the people that have never had water in all these years and everything's being raised now, who do they go to and present to you that this is real, that we've never had water? Is that something to take into consideration, Jim, that we can form together as a community and say, hey, look, we got this going on. Seawalls brought up higher, and we all have proof that we've never had water, like the gentleman on wherever he was with the blizzard of '78. But if he's never had any problems, I think, does that make sense? You know, regroup, maybe, you know, give us, you know, a year and a half, 2 years to get everybody together to say, all right, we have all of our stuff together. It says we never had any water here. And who does that go to? Does it need to be through a lawyer? And then as far as elevation certificates, do you guys plan on refunding all the property owners that have had to go and get new certificates? Is that, I mean, does that make sense, Jim? What's going on? It's kind of towards you, but towards everybody else, towards you guys.
Derek, they're great questions. First of all, for the question the gentleman over here before who said we've never had water, those are things that from common sense that I think all of us would like to have reflected in the meetings that we've had with FEMA. They said, look, we're not looking at that. We're looking at whatever we have determined from all of our determinations of the still water level and with the wave action. We're going to have a new analysis. So even though we haven't seen water, even as I said for Marshfield Center's never seen any kind of wave action. The data that they had come back, which is why we believe it should be challenged, is showing 3-foot waves or wave action in Marshfield Center. It's showing people who've never had water. They're saying, no, you know what, we have to plan for a 1% storm. It was a great question with this gentleman in the whole series of them is, how can we plan if we know what happened in the blizzard of '78? We have all of our engineering data. We know in Marshfield exactly where the water came. We have some great, you're going to hear from Doris Crary in a moment, but we already have the engineers for the town who did that work. We think that's a good way to base upon what could happen in the future. It would be helpful if you guys, you can't probably do it tonight, but if you could give it back to us saying, how much worse are we trying to plan for? How much worse in the blizzard of '78? Because if Rod Procaccino was here tonight, our town engineer, respectfully, he was seeing the analysis that's being done, and he believes you're taking wave action that's going in one direction, wind action that would be coming another direction, and respectfully, he's saying he doesn't think that could ever happen. So, Derek, but to answer your question, I do think those are some things that the young lady behind you is going to speak in a moment. Doris Curry is talking about how to collect that kind of data and see if we can incorporate that as we give our feedback to FEMA. So they're very good questions.
Thank you, Jim. I just don't want the town to turn into a ghost town. You know, that's kind of where it's going. Everybody's going to be, younger couples are going to be just forced out. And the area's getting busy enough as it is. You know, so let's be real about this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Thomas Bertolone. I've got a couple of Marshfield investments. One happens to be in the new I think I went from 9 to 16 feet. That's a disaster. But that's 55 Marshfield Drive. My concern is actually with this bigger water bill. From my understanding, it was a national transportation bill that we ended up with another bill. What is that, earmark or something? I don't understand how we ended up passing a bill like that and then finding out that we do research and we do a STAR investigation with these wave things after the bill was voted on. It sounds like an Obamacare thing, but I'm a little concerned about that, okay? So the whole thing's a catastrophe, all right? The other thing I want to point out is, I understand that we have congressmen here, and all due respect, I'm hearing some terms that are supposed to be comforting everybody, terms such as phase in, phase out, delay in the premiums. We're going to give people a temporary break. I mean, these people, you work for these people and you're going to give them something? Okay. We're going to freeze things. You know, what you're doing is you're delaying the catastrophe. Now, if I'm on a plane and the pilot says we're going to crash, but we're going to delay it for 2 hours, I'm going to go, now wait a minute here, okay? I don't like any of this delay stuff, okay? We have a catastrophe here and it needs to be averted completely. No delays.
Understood.
By the way, this is a tax. I'm just telling you, this is a taxation without representation.
Okay,
That's
I'm
what
going
this
to go
is.
to the next question.
My name is Doris Prairie, and I'm part of the Marshfield Citizens Coastal Coalition. And I have been very active in flood insurance since after the '91 storm. And we gave testimony in Washington at that time. I have also been in charge of the CRS program for the town of Marshfield. I've been on the board for CRS in Scituate. So to say the least is to say flood insurance is very dear to my heart. I feel very bad about what is happening here tonight, and I am on the sides of the citizens. And I'd like to start with one point that I think is really important to know. After the blizzard of 1978, which was the worst storm of record, I happen to own the same house that I owned at that time up on Maycumbers Ridge, and I can tell you nothing has ever been as close as that storm was. This town had surveyors who went out and they surveyed the town for the reach and the height of the water in that storm. That was all documented down at the Marshfield Town Hall. They had that information, they looked at it, it came in around a little over 10 feet, and then they arrived at a new number, which was elevation 11. This town has supported and put into effect an elevation 11. So it was never elevation 10 here. If you put a basement in your house after 1978, that floor was at 11 or higher. That elevation, I believe, has protected this town so that if we look at the number of properties today that are sustaining damage after storms like we had in 2010 and this past winter, I believe that number is down a lot since 1991 when we had the no-name storm. And it's coming down because of 35 years of enforcement that brought a higher elevation than what might have been on the maps. I happen to be in an area where my elevation was 10, but I was informed I had to be 11. So I understand that, and I know that, you know what, they got it right, because the storms have never been as high as the blizzard of '78, and the elevation 11 has protected my house ever since '78. It was not at 11 when the storm hit. So I've had a flood insurance premium policy on that house for 40 years. It's had one loss, and that was 1978. But I think what's important is we have to take that information and overlay that on these maps. And I don't think we'll find much of the new area in there. And because of that, we want you to use information that's factually accurate, not mythical maybes. And any other questions? I would like to see this legislation modified in many ways. And let me start with the first one, the actuarial rates. We would like to see these reformed so that the basements are eliminated out of it and not counted in. If somebody built a home in full compliance with regulations, they should not be, after the fact, having to change and to be hit with these kind of premiums, that $6,000, $10,000 premiums. It is not fair. The other thing we would like to see is a cap on the flood insurance premium brought back down to the 10% increase. What many of you may not know who are not or in the special flood hazard area is there is now a new cap. The new cap is 20% that your flood insurance can go up anyway, and we would like to see it brought back down to the 10%, which is a more reasonable and moderate rate. The next thing is the 5% increase on premiums, which are for those of us that have policies already. We pay now a 5% increase to build a catastrophic fund. And this goes to our people in Washington. We want to see that that money is locked up that it doesn't get away and it's not used for flood insurance as a catastrophic fund. We also believe that the firms, these maps that we have, are not reasonable. What we would like to, and what I would offer as a suggestion, if you want to map in all these new areas, and they've never had any prior flood damage, and people don't have policies in them, just as you have the preferred risk policy, we would like to suggest that maybe you create the preferred flood hazard area, which is an area that may represent more to the 100 to 500 year zone, and there reflects the premiums, they're covered, it'll add more money to the fund, but it'll certainly make it much fairer for the homeowners that get locked into these areas. And that, and then the other thing is, you know, the one thing I want to point out is for people who are in these A zones, for every foot that you're below that elevation, we were given some preliminary data, and I don't know, I'd like to know if you could comment on it. And the preliminary data was that for every foot it would be approximately $1,200 added into the premium. And for those of you in the V zone, for every foot you were below the BFE, it was going to be around $2,500 a foot. So I would just like to know, is that information, anybody here who can comment on that?
No.
No.
Okay. I don't know where you got that information from, but we can't make assumptions about what the costs are below.
Okay. No, this was an
Certainly
average.
not by foot.
Right, this was an average that we had asked about, approximately, what it meant to the homeowners. But we clearly feel that this is really unfair to the town, and it's an impossible timeline. So I'm looking forward to having our representatives change this in Washington.
So the people that are in line now, these will be the last questions that we take. And again, I just want to reiterate that this group of people here, we cannot change the law. If you have specific questions about insurance and the maps regarding your structures, that we can definitely help you with. And I'm going over to this side now.
Joe Pasevich, Wilson Road. I'm down there, Plymouth Ave, block and a half from the water. I want to ask, first of all, I want to make a point. Whenever there's a number put on a map, like my zone is now AE16. Most people here probably already know, but it hasn't been really specified yet tonight. The 16 is the elevation that the water can be expected once in 100 years to actually rise to, right? The 1% flood. So there's a 1% chance in any given year that I will see 16, an elevation 16 water level at my location. It's gone from 9 to 16 since about 2006. And you're saying that the still water elevations are still being held at the 1988 calculated values, right? Are those still water elevations subject to change, maybe revision upward due to climate change or something like that?
We don't consider the climate change when we're making the maps. You're paying, the engineering analysis is a snapshot in time, so it's the observation of what's happened. So we've seen up to a certain point, the observed sea level rise, but we don't make a future projection of what that would be when we're making the map.
But don't you calculate what you expect a typical 100-year storm to bring in terms of storm surge? Like where you expect the ocean to be during a 100-year storm?
But that's based on the past observations, not future potential.
And has that changed at all since in the last 6 years or 10 years?
No, we took the numbers from the effective flood studies, which was 2006 timeframe.
What do you consider the 78 storm? Is that a 75-year storm, an 80-year storm, a 100-year storm? What is it officially considered to be?
Don't know off the top of my head.
No idea whatsoever?
I don't know what the elevation was in comparison to what the numbers are now.
There have been so many studies of the 78 storm, I'm surprised you don't know. But I appreciate you guys here. I think your boss should have been here tonight. I feel for you guys because you're taking the heat in all these different kinds of meetings. But I don't know who the boss of FEMA 1 is, but he should have been here. One last thing. CRS. I read in the paper, our town officials are saying we are not part of the CRS anymore. But I heard earlier tonight that Scituate is. What happened to Marshfield's CRS? standard. Is that program still in effect, and why did Marshfield lose it?
We're working with the building officials in Marshfield to get Marshfield back into the CRS program. There was a lapse as far as the accreditation. There was from what I understand, part of it was that the all-hazard mitigation plan lapsed, and that was a significant point reduction for CRS, which resulted in the retrograde.
I know, because I'm a little bit familiar with this, because you guys or someone from FEMA is supposed to come into town each year and do a survey, and you've got about 10 pages of checkoff items, so you're saying that somebody dropped the ball in our town. That's what it sounds like, that dropped us out of the CRS. Am I hearing you correct? Or maybe it's not your job to to determine how it...
There are certification visits that are conducted every year, and at that time, CRS, for those that are not familiar with it, for when the community goes above and beyond minimum NFIP standards, certain points are awarded, and the more points that are awarded, the less, as far as, or the greater reduction that you would have in a flood insurance premium. So Marshfield was a Class 8 community, which resulted in a 10% discount in flood insurance premiums for most people. I do not know what happened at the town level. I cannot say. I don't work for the town. We just come in on a yearly basis and look at the activities that are being performed, and if they're not being performed, we can't award the points for them. And so that would be a question that you would have to ask locally.
I know, but the accreditation forms have to be signed by a town official. I want to make a point. Do you guys interact with other federal agencies? Is there communication with other agencies outside of FEMA when you talk about flood impacts and impacts of new maps and things like that?
We do work with other federal agencies. In what regard?
Well, I just want to say, the next time you talk to the FAA, tell them not to spend $10 million on the expansion of Marshfield Airport and a salt marsh. The $10 million will go a long way to finishing the seawall projects in Marshfield, rather than to a little tiny airport that serves a tiny number of people and destroys wetlands. Thank you.
Sir?
Malcolm Gale, Nantasket Street. This mostly is insurance. I've been a builder in town up and down the coast for a number of years. And the building we had been doing was all based on the elevation 11, which has been brought up. You're doing away with the grandfathering now, so that all those houses that have been built at that elevation are now going to be considered to be in a hazard area, AE, B, or whatever.
Yeah, what the Big Waters Act mandated was that we phase out grandfathering. The deadline for FEMA to come up with an implementation plan for the phase out is the end of 2014. So we have to do something. It's on the table for next year.
Okay, what about all those houses that were built on that 1% chance in 1 in 100 years? At that time, now they're going to be charged X amount of dollars because they never needed flood insurance, so they can no longer get a decent rate flood policy. And
that potentially could be correct, because if they phase it out, they're going to gradually go towards being rated at the actual current map elevation. But again, I don't know how that's going to start and how long it's going to take, but it's mandated by the bill.
okay, now you also count your basements as being your bottom level?
Yes.
That's where your elevation starts at?
Yeah.
But you don't insure basements?
We insure foundations, we insure
Okay.
the big ticket items generally are covered. It's mostly the contents and the finishing work.
Okay, you do insure foundations?
Yes.
Okay, I have a house that I just worked on to get a family back in Wrexham this year. They were run out in the February storm.
Mm-hmm.
He has just received a rejection letter due to the fact FEMA has determined that it wasn't done by the floodwaters, but it was done by the returning waters to repair his foundation. So therefore, it's a catch-22. Sounds like a shell game.
Well, I don't know.
I realize you don't write the checks. I realize that, but this is something I think that needs to be looked at. You're saying that, oh, we'll take it on the incoming tide, but as the tide goes around, even though we didn't see that, we think it did that, and therefore we're not going to cover it. So that's, and I realize again, you do not write the checks. I realize that. You don't make that decision. And if my information is correct also, will some people be charged retroactively for their insurance back to 2012?
The first piece of the subsidies, the older homes, that will be the case. If somebody got a flood insurance policy for the first time, and the effective date of it was after July 6th of 2012, the first renewal policy that takes effect after October 1st of 2013, they will be asked for an elevation certificate for the next renewal.
So those people who built under the guidelines of the previous, that they were at elevation 11 thereabouts and had a flood insurance
No,
policy.
I'm talking two different things.
Okay, all
The
right.
only ones that we know right now would be somebody who's not rated using elevation, which is generally the older homes.
Now, this will go to Star, I assume. This will be my last question. When are your next map revisions so that we know how high to build them now for the next ones? And that-
Go ahead.
My name is Kathy Sullivan. I live at 112 Plymouth Avenue in Marshfield, and my head is reeling. I can't even begin to ask my questions, but I thank all of you for coming tonight and, you know, enlightening us to the degree that we are enlightened, and especially Congressman Lynch and Congressman Keating's aide. I think there's a lot that needs to be done in Washington very soon. My question really is for the Marshfield selectmen and maybe even for the Scituate selectmen. What is the town of Marshfield going to do? Are you going to appeal? What do we as people need to do here tonight to help you help us?
Well, as you heard earlier, the main thing right now is we're trying to get folks to identify their home. I heard a lot of questions tonight. Folks need to make sure, number one, if you're in the flood elevation and what it is. All right. As we get information back from these folks, and we've got an awful lot tonight in regards to whether or not they think that there's an issue here, and obviously there is, we will look into what we can do as a town, or possibly some sort of a joint venture with surrounding towns in regards to do something in regards to the new FEMA maps. You know, the gentleman over here earlier spoke before, and a lot of people laughed, and because, I don't know if they laughed just because they thought it was ridiculous, but here's some of his statements over the fact the majority of these homes have never seen water. We've been working not only in regards to trying to adapt whether or not we're going to go forward with some sort of resolution to try to get this rolled back, but at the same time, we're trying to look into what the future of Marshfield is going to be if this stays the way it is. And I have to be honest with you, it's not very appealing. So to answer your question, we are looking into it. We're looking into it every day. We're working 7 days a week on this. We developed a team. Six of our paid professionals at Town Hall are working on it. The selectmen are working on it. We're getting weekly updates in regards to it. We're talking to Jim Cantwell, trying to get some sort of sense of where Scituate is on this also. There's nothing right now in black and white in regards to what we're going to do for the appeal, but we are looking into some sort of relief for these folks will have to deal with.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jackie Finn. I live at 11 Housebrook Road in Marshfield. We're new to the area. We just purchased our home in May. So first I just want to thank everybody in the town of Marshfield. You've been so wonderful and kind and generous to our family and welcoming to our children. This is a great place to live. And you've got a lot of sassy people here. I'm from Philly, and they don't have anything on you. My question, I think, is for Bob. So we purchased a home in May. It was not in a flood zone. Now it's AE15. We don't have flood insurance. When we purchased the home, it wasn't required. It wasn't in the zone. It was built in 1969. What should I do to help sleep better at night?
I would get a preferred policy right now when you're not in a high hazard flood zone. That'll become your anchor policy. You can ask the agent to quote different limits of coverage. Agents, because of their legal exposure, they'll always recommend that you be covered to the full value of your house. But you can certainly get a lower limit and just sign a waiver to let them know that this was your choice. That would become your anchor policy. That's going to be a preferred policy with very low rates for the full 12 months that it stays in force. If sometime during the 12 months the map takes effect, which was scheduled for June of next year, your policy will ride as a regular preferred policy until it expires. Then your company should notify you prior to the next renewal that the maps have changed and that you may be eligible for 2 years of a preferred policy based on the fact that this is the first time that you've been mapped into a high hazard flood zone. That would be another 2 years of preferred at a slightly higher rate, but you wouldn't have to deal with elevation certificates or anything. That would be your best approach and then things might change along the way. You might look at things differently. We might have more information, and but start with getting a quote for a preferred policy.
Okay, thank you. Sir?
Hi, my name is Damien Chandler. I live in Surfside Road, Scituate, and I echo the ladies' comments. I moved in about 6 months ago, and we made some very good friends very fast, and the people have been very, very welcoming, and I love the area. The question I have a couple of observations and a question. Firstly, I am an engineer as well, and I haven't worked in hydrodynamics, but I worked as an aerodynamicist for a couple of decades. And in computer modeling, when you take your inputs and you get your outputs, on the inputs you have certain tolerances. You've had empirical data, you've got some modeling data, and you probably have 50 different inputs. Each one of those inputs have some kind of tolerance of error. How did you account for that error from your inputs to your outputs? Here's what I've heard. I had a study because I had a sensor here and a sensor down there, and I couldn't figure it out. So I took an insurance study, right? What was the objective of that insurance study? What was the tolerances of that data? And as you're doing your modeling and you get your inputs and your outputs, you might have 1 foot plus or minus half a foot, 5 foot plus or minus 1 foot, and out of that comes 10 foot plus or minus 0. This is gospel. It's impossible to have that. So my question to you is, when your output came out as being 10 foot plus or minus 5 foot, because you've got all of these input tolerances, what number did you pick, 5 foot or 15 foot? Because everything I've heard so far is we're being conservative, we're being conservative. And if you're not careful, as you know, these models are not linear, they're very, very non-linear. And if you keep going conservative, 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 what you'll get is the 0.1% storm, not the 1% storm. And I think that's what happens when a guy who lives 5 miles from the beach gets told the wave's going to come through a second floor window. Because I think we're modeling a 1,000-year storm.
Fortunately, we don't do really refined modeling. The level of effort that's performed is at a transect basis. So our input conditions are topographic information, still water elevation, a wave height, and the associated wave setup component. So those are the 4 terms that we put in there. The topographic information, FEMA has a standard that all topographic data, the LiDAR especially, has to be collected and have a tolerance, or it's an accuracy of it's 28 centimeters, which is about 9 inches. So that's in the topographic data.
So there's a
for the still water elevations, those come from. It's basically just a return period analysis. So it's just, here's all these numbers, and then I do a return period analysis, find the best extremal fit, and that's the 1% chance value that's pulled. Same is true for wave height conditions, and then everything kind of feeds into a wave setup calculator. It's an empirical equation based on field observations and laboratory tank tests. So we don't really incorporate a level of the confidence limits. It's just the confidence limits come out as we make the map. The base flood elevations, if you noticed on the maps, are whole foot values, and that's because it's just a rounding. So an elevation of 16 is actually something between 15.5 and 16.4.
I don't think it'd be that accurate because just your one input had a 9-inch, almost a foot tolerance. So there's no way your output could be more accurate than one of your inputs, right? I mean, if you go back to your study, this insurance study, if you're using a sensor 50 miles away from another sensor, there's no way you can be within 6 inches of accuracy on your output. It's just not going to happen. So what I would ask is, can you guys ask for a measurement system analysis based on an independent study, using maybe a Monte Carlo analysis or something? I mean, you use Monte Carlo analysis even in financial data, which is even more static than wave action. You can put tolerances, bell curves, Y-wall curves on all your inputs, get your transfer function, figure out your output, and get a much more accurate on risk analysis on your output with some simple mathematics using Monte Carlo analysis, all sorts of modeling tools. When people's lives are based on the data that you're doing, you guys owe it to us to do a measurement system analysis to prove to us that you can actually measure the output based on some reasonable assumption of your input. It has to be done.
Not when they're just trying to raise money.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at the insurance, you're using insurance data.
Give us your name. Sure, your name?
Name, number, business card.
Go ahead.
Just curious, why is it that it seems everyone that's in an AE is at a 16? You got Brent Rock, you got Green Harbor. I think she's a 16 over in Homeland. Marshfield Drive's a 16. Why is everybody a 16?
I'm gonna speculate, but my guess is that it's all based on that wave setup term. So the wave setup term, again, new, but it's so we are, FEMA's guidelines and standards state that we are to take that wave setup term out to the limit of the coastal floodplain. And there's no frictional dissipation whatsoever.
So you treat it as it's all flat ground?
No, it's not treated as flat ground. It's treated just such that it doesn't impact or reduce in any way that the inclusion of that term.
Okay. Who's coming up? Who's determining the amount of the insurance? The insurance companies or you guys?
No, there's an actuarial team in FEMA headquarters.
What does that mean?
An actuarial team is just somebody that they analyze our experience at every single one of the levels where we have premium breaking points. So that could be different premiums for different flood zones, you know, maybe higher premiums for the V zone, the velocity zone than an AE. They basically then come up with their model, and they literally will come out with a new manual, and they develop a rate for $100 of insurance. And ultimately, if they feel that going forward, that they look at the past and they project that we need a certain premium level to be able to pay losses going forward, then those usually come across as rate increases.
Okay, I have a problem with that. I live in the Brent Rock section.
Yep.
There's losses there. I've been there 28 years. I rose my house up out of the floodplain. I put a retaining wall out back. Never once put in a claim. Never once had water. And now I'm going to be lumped in with people that had repetitive losses on my insurance.
I don't think so.
I'm in the Brent Rock area, and you just basically said.
No, the people who are in the group that have had severe repetitive losses, you know, will be getting significantly higher premium increases. You sound like, did you elevate your house? Do you know if you're being rated based on elevation?
I'm only at an 11, and I need to be at a 16 now.
But your current policy is rated using elevation. Yeah, you will not see those type increases at all.
For 1 year, right? Or 2 years? Or never?
Generally speaking, the biggest increases are going to hit the category of risks that had the biggest subsidies, which were the older homes that weren't being rated using the elevation. If you already have a policy that rated based on your elevation, most of what you're going to see now, the one exception to that is going to be what the gentleman, you know, asked me to describe earlier. If you're benefiting, when these maps take effect next year, If grandfathering were to stay in place, you would benefit from the grandfathering because we would keep rating you at the same criteria. When grandfathering, which is scheduled to be phased out with an implementation plan at the end of 2014, you should have concerns there, because in phasing out whatever grandfather benefits you have, that would mean additional increases each year.
Big increases, like retroactive increases?
They could be
to make
big,
up to the
they
actuarial?
could be big increases. If the new map, instead of being, I forget what you said was your elevation, but instead of being 2 feet above the 1% flood line, if the new map has you 5 feet below, then in theory, they would have to come up with an implementation plan that would get you over a period of years to be rated using the current map information.
So basically, you're punishing the grandfathering by phasing it out later and then making us pay bigger amounts in shorter time periods.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing, and Ivy has mentioned this, is we have to implement the law and the rules, and Bigot Waters was a mandate to, to take out the subsidies. So the best we can do is try to describe to you without holding anything back as to, what long-term, how this might impact you. And oftentimes, talking to a group, your situation is different than yours, so we try to talk with one-on-one as best we can. But the grandfathering would definitely impact people. Once that's in place to be phased out, you could see some very significant rate increases over whatever period of time the plan, phases it out.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Mary Prendergast, 1 Park Ave, Marshfield. Earlier, someone was asking about the appeal process, and the gentleman from STAR said that the topography maps they could get from him only if he got approval from FEMA. Why can't you give that approval right now? FEMA. Why should everybody go on an individual basis, gather their neighbors? We as a community know we need that information. I don't understand why it can't be blanketed given at this time.
The approval, it's given to Brian. So,
but why can't Brian just give it to everybody? It be available at Town Hall for our perusal.
it is available at this time at Town Hall. It's been given to the towns when they were delivered their preliminary data.
Okay. Then going back to this piece of paper that was out in the lobby, in regards to, like many people, never, I've been an X, I'm going to AE. I'm at an 11, I'm a post-firm build. I need to be at a 15, I'm at 11. Based on what you have here, it's saying anything below a difference of 4 feet. My insurance is going to be $9,500 a year. Paper you've provided.
Yeah, I think the big thing would be, do you have a flood insurance policy right now?
Why would I? I'm not in a flood, I wasn't in a flood zone.
Right, but I'm just saying that what you would want to consider is to take advantage of the fact that those maps have not taken effect yet. And right now, being in a non-high hazard flood zone, you'd qualify for a preferred policy and start out with that for 12 months, and then when the maps change, then you would be eligible under that first time.
That part I understand, but somewhere along the line, someone up here said that you couldn't determine what the cap would be on insurance. So I'm assuming that if it's $9,500, it's not going to go below it.
If you were rated on elevation with an elevation certificate and it had the same numbers as it is on that example, that's what the premium would be right now.
Congressman, you have a lot of work. I did see this. I got it off of the Marshfield Coalition. I don't know if you're aware. I have contacted your office as well as every other person that represents us in Washington to get this moving now. We don't have time to delay. You said that we can do it the hard way or the easy way. When would we hear about legal recourse from you or from the folks in DC?
We would have to talk
Okay.
with the whole team and figure out how soon we can do that.
Okay. Thank you.
We have one more question, and the cafeteria is going to close at 10 p.m.
My name is Kathleen Tatro, and I live on 47 Homeland Drive. My question is actually an insurance question. We purchased our home in 2004. In 2006, we were notified that we were now in a flood zone, AE flood zone. We had to purchase flood insurance at that time for the full mortgage cost of our house, not replacement cost on the house. My question is, why are we insuring at a full mortgage price when the land, we're not supposed to be insuring the land, we're supposed to be insuring the replacement cost of the home. We're paying over $2,000 a year for flood insurance. We're 2 miles from the beach, just like what everyone else is saying. We don't understand why we were put in that zone. So we were going through this on our own, my husband and I, in 2006. So now the whole town is involved in it. And, you know, like, this replacement cost of the house is what you're saying. But when actuality, if you have a mortgage on the home, it goes back to what you mortgaged your home for.
Hey, actually, in the state of Massachusetts, they passed a law several years ago, and it was more driven by homeowners insurance, but it basically said that a bank can't make you carry more insurance than 100% of the replacement cost of the building. My understanding is that similarly, we don't have that kind of a law federally, but if a lender is making you carry flood insurance above the replacement cost of the building, that the insurance department, you know, would want to hear that. Oh, the banking department, it's a banking law.
So for 7 years, we've been paying that premium.
Again, I don't know your specific situation and what they were thinking or why they wanted that. I'm just telling you that maybe one recourse that you have right now would be to just check the banking laws in the state, because my understanding is that they can't force somebody to carry a higher amount of insurance than 100% of the replacement cost.
What if I don't owe any money on my house? What if I don't owe any money on my house? Do I have to have flood insurance?
Ma'am, I can't, we're really running out of time.
So when I moved into my neighborhood, I was basically the new person in the neighborhood. I was the only one carrying the mortgage. So in 2006, all my neighbors who have been living there since whenever the houses were built, they didn't have to pay flood insurance. They chose not to pay flood insurance, but they were in a flood zone. I had a mortgage, I had to pay flood insurance in order to stay in that home after 2 years of living there without having to have flood insurance. So if you don't have a mortgage, you don't need flood insurance?
Yeah. No, if the banks, the lenders do have a federal requirement law that if the building that is securing the loan, if the loan is backed by the federal government, then they have no choice. They have to have a flood insurance policy in place, either one issued by the National Flood Program or one issued by a private carrier. So if you do not have a mortgage, then, you know, technically there's nobody forcing you to have the flood insurance.
But just be aware, if you have a mortgage, it is going to be based on your mortgage, not just on the replacement cost.
Well,
that's what we found, and it was less than half a foot in a finished, unfinished basement. The whole mortgage has to be over $2,000 a year on top of our homeowners insurance.
Yeah, well, again, that would be something you might want to look into the banking laws.
We have one last question about map revision process, and then I'll turn it over to close the meeting.
So we've talked a lot tonight about this appeals process, this statutory 90 days appeals / comments process. There is one point that hasn't gotten stressed yet, which is probably a pretty important point. There is also a separate procedure and process for changing effective maps at any time. It's called the letter of map revision process. Well, actually, sorry, letter of map change process. And under the letter of map change process, there are two potential changes. There's a letter of map revision, which is for a larger area, usually a development, a subdivision, or a condo area, and letter of map amendment, which is typically for a single residential lot. For the letter of map revision, if you wanted to refute the flood elevation, you wanted to refute the science behind the elevation at your location, that's what you would be going through, that letter of map revision process. You're going to submit from an engineer, an architect, a land surveyor, better scientific and technical data to refute our study. For the letter of map amendment, as the single individual home lot, you are going to provide site-specific data. So everyone kept mentioning that elevation certificate form tonight. That's a specific form. If you go to Google or Bing, whichever one you like, and you type in FEMA, F-E-M-A, LOMA, L as in Lucy, O, M as in Mary, A as in amendment, it will take you to that form. It's an easy 2-page form to fill out with probably 10 pages of instructions, to be honest. You hire a surveyor to come out and shoot some elevations. There are some critical elevations on that form that need to be captured, the lowest floor being one of them, the lowest adjacent grade where the dirt touches your foundation. One key thing to keep in mind is that it's the foundation, your home itself, or anything structurally attached to it. So a garage, a deck, if the lowest part of where the dirt touches the foundation is at a deck post that's structurally attached to your home, that elevation becomes your lowest elevation. So you file that form, you send it into FEMA, the instructions tell you where to mail it to. There is no filing fee for the individual letter of map amendment. And depending on what goes on with the letter of map revision, that bigger it's actually going to change the map, there are some filing fees associated with that. Key thing to keep in mind, that process is against the map that's in effect at the time. So if you filed one today, you'd be filing that against your 2012 map. And as Brian and Star goes through this process, we're constantly looking at what letter of map changes have occurred in the community prior to the maps becoming effective. So if appropriate, we will incorporate them. If not appropriate, we would then supersede them. Once these maps do go effective in June of 2014, this process is available to you to make changes down the road.
Thank you. We understand the frustration. We heard a lot of good comments tonight. We are committed, this team here is committed to getting information to you as much as possible so that you have an understanding of what exists today. And we're not responsible for a lot of the changes that you have suggested. And we just hope that you bear with us, our patience. We tried to get to everybody that we can tonight, and we are committed to bringing the information as we can to each individual.
Once again, I'd like to thank you all for coming. On behalf of the town of Marshfield and town of Scituate, again, I'd like to thank you for your input. I'd like to thank our local, state, and federal officials for the help tonight. Congressman Keating's office helped out a lot with Representative Cantwell to have FEMA come to this meeting. So we heard some great words tonight from the congressman. And I would also like to thank everyone from FEMA and DCR and staff for also participating. So like I said, till 10 o'clock tonight, if you have any follow-up questions, they'll be available. Thank you.